This is one of the darkest episodes in modern British and indeed Irish history. It began with sectarian rioting in the streets of Northern Ireland, but it escalated into something much more sinister. Effectively a low-level civil war between rival paramilitary groups and the British Army. And today we call this conflict the Troubles, a conflict that claimed thousands of lives, including the lives of almost 2,000 entirely innocent civilians. And at the peak of the violence in the early 1970s, almost 500 people were being killed every year, and a bomb was going off in Belfast every single day. Even where you start the story is a political choice in itself.
Right, because of the coming of the Normans.
Right, so you could go really far back. I mean, a lot of people in Britain, when they tell the story, they sort of assume that the violence just exploded out of nowhere, and it was carried out by psychopathic extremists who were motivated by or exploiting ancient hatreds. And it's senseless, inexplicable, or all this kind of thing. Now, of course, if you're an Irish nationalist, you would start the story much earlier. You would say, well, you shouldn't start in the 1960s. You should start maybe with the Normans arriving in Ireland, maybe with Elizabeth I or Oliver Cromwell, the plantation of Ulster, the importation of tens of thousands of English and Scottish colonists. And they would say you should start the story there. Unfortunately, we no longer live in a world where the rest is history can do 13-part series. And we have done the story of Ireland before. So I think a sensible compromise is if we just pick up the story at the early 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, in 1900, there are about 4.5 million people on the island of Ireland, and they are subjects of the United Kingdom. And most of them, 3/4 of them are Catholic, and 1/4 of them are Protestant. And the Protestants are mostly concentrated in the northeastern part of the island, so that is in the province of Ulster, and around the city, the industrial city of Belfast, the place where the Titanic was built. Mm-hmm. If you want to hear more about that, we did a whole series about the Titanic and its origins in Belfast. And in the first 20 years or so of the century, massive controversy about Ireland's political future. The nationalists, who are mostly Catholic, want home rule or independence, but the unionists, who are typically Protestant, want to stay part of the United Kingdom. And the unionists in the northeast are so bitterly opposed to the prospect of home rule from Dublin in a Catholic-dominated Ireland that in 1912, almost 500,000 of them, led by Sir Edward Carson, sign a covenant pledging to use all means necessary to fight against home rule. And the legacy of this will reverberate down the generations long into the 1970s and beyond.
I suppose it kind of offers a historical precedent for paramilitary activity, doesn't it?
Absolutely it does.
It's a kind of heroic model of, well, if you're not a paramilitary, you'd call it gangsterism.
Yes, of course. And almost all of the paramilitaries we will meet in this series would look back to the events of the 1910s and 1920s and say, I'm doing as my forefathers did before me. So absolutely, the history really matters. So 100,000 of these people who signed the covenant organised into the paramilitary volunteers, and they smuggled tens of thousands of guns into Ulster, and they were preparing for civil war. But then the First World War intervened, and a lot of the volunteers went off to fight. A lot of them fought at Gallipoli, or indeed at the Somme, which became a kind of sacred moment for the Protestants of Ulster, 1916. But also in 1916, at Easter, there was a nationalist uprising in Dublin, and that was followed by a guerrilla campaign, largely in the south of Ireland, the Catholic bits of Ireland, that undermined British authority completely.
So, Dominic, I'm sure you've been to the Shankill Road and the Falls Road. So the Shankill Road is the Protestant, the street that runs through the Protestant heartland of Belfast, and the Falls Road is Catholic. They're separated now by peace walls, aren't they?
Yeah.
But there are kind of Checkpoint Charlie type places where they join. And on one side, there are murals of the Battle of the Somme, poppies, graveyards, British military heroes.
Yes.
And on the other side, all up the Falls Road, there are kind of murals of the Easter Rising. And it's like kind of the history is literally written onto the bricks.
It is, absolutely. Two rival histories describing the same period, but in completely different terms. Exactly right. So anyway, back to the story. In 1922, the British agreed a treaty that would turn Ireland into a free state, a dominion under the crown, and basically put it on the road to independence as a republic, which it becomes in 1949. But there was a catch. 2 years earlier, the British had allowed 6 counties in the northeast to form a separate entity called Northern Ireland with its own parliament in Belfast. And the treaty that they do in 1922 allows this entity to opt out of the new Free State and to remain as part of the United Kingdom. And the Parliament of Northern Ireland immediately says that's what it wants to do. And so this is what gives you the partition of the island of Ireland.
Dominic, can I just ask, there was never any question that they would just become a kind of independent statelet?
No, too small to be a statelet and dependent on money from Westminster. So this is a sort of theme that comes up again and again in the 70s, where British prime ministers will say, we're giving you all this money, why can't you do what we want you to do?
But it is a theme, isn't it, also, that the Protestants of Ulster don't really like Britain, or they don't really like British governments.
They like the idea of Britain, but not the reality of British governments, I think is fair.
Yeah.
So I think they think that British governments are not good at defending British interests and that they're better at it.
Yeah.
And they regard the British as weak, and they think the British don't understand their unique situation.
Which I guess is kind of true.
To a degree, it is probably true. So anyway, the partition of Ireland. In the south, you have 26 counties, overwhelming Catholic majority, capital in Dublin. This in 1949 becomes the Republic of Ireland. And then in the northeast, there are 6 counties. Northern Ireland, it's a self-governing bit of the United Kingdom, capital in Belfast, Parliament at Stormont on the Stormont estate in Belfast, and a 2/3 Protestant majority. Now, Ian Paisley, he called it Ulster, and lots of people do call it Ulster. Actually, it's only 6 of the 9 historic counties of the province of Ulster. So this is a very good way to annoy Irish nationalists if you call it Ulster, because they will point out it's actually not all of Ulster.
Every geographical expression in the story annoys people.
It does indeed.
So British Isles, Ireland, whatever. I mean, always pregnant with annoyance for everyone.
Every name is a choice, basically. And I'm sure there were lots of people who say, well, you got this wrong. You should have said this. You should have said the other. I mean, we're going to try our best.
And I speak as the man who uttered the word Londonderry in the Dublin GPO.
Yeah, you corrected Paul Rouse when we did a series about Ireland. You corrected a professor of history at University College Dublin.
I was just, sticking up for Ulster.
Yeah, you were.
Reminding him that there are 2 words for it.
Ian Paisley would have been proud of you. So, to nationalists, partition is the original sin of modern Irish history, a blight that should be rectified. I think most historians, including most Irish historians, would agree that partition was probably inevitable. That basically, once the Ulster Volunteers had, as it were, signed their covenant, they'd armed themselves, they were never going to be forced into a united Ireland without a civil war. And basically, that was the choice. You partition the island, or it all kicks off and you have a civil war.
But even if you had a civil war, what do you do?
Yeah, where are they going to go? There's, 1 million people or whatever it is.
With guns?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not good.
No. So at the time when Ireland was partitioned, I think a lot of nationalists just assumed that over time, it would wither away. Partition would wither away. The 6 counties one day would agree to join a united Ireland. It was their destiny. And obviously that didn't work out. Northern Ireland as an entity proved much more resilient than they had expected. But that said, from the start, there's a serious fracture line that runs through Northern Ireland. So the Unionist leaders, when they basically took 6 counties, they had guaranteed themselves a 2/3 Protestant majority. They could have asked for more counties, but of course those counties had a lot of Catholics. They didn't want them. So they've got their 2/3 majority.
So they're gerrymandering.
I mean, you could say effectively, yes.
Yeah.
But what that means, of course, is that 1/3 of the people in this new state are not Protestants. They are Catholics. So this is 500,000 people who are not best pleased at the idea of living in a majority Protestant Unionist state. And partly as a result of this whole process was accompanied at the time by considerable violence. Now, the early 20s is a very violent time across Europe. There are all kinds of ethnic conflicts and there are border disputes and all of these kinds of things. And by those standards, not a lot of people die, but by the standards of the islands of Britain and Ireland, a lot of people do die. So between the summer of 1920 and the summer of 1922, there's this intense street fighting between the IRA and the security forces, especially in Belfast. And by the time it's over, more than 500 people have been killed, most of them Catholic civilians, 10,000 Catholics driven out of their jobs, 25,000 Catholics driven out of their homes by violence and by arson, and so on and so forth.
I mean, one difference between Ireland and other parts of Europe in the wake of the First World War, that the violence in Ireland is it's a continuity. And doesn't Churchill has that kind of famous phrase about the flood, isn't it? And as the waters subside, we see the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone. They're still there. And that, I guess, is part of what gives the story around this the sense of ancient hatreds. The idea that there's no solution to the situation.
Well, to some extent, people are the prisoners of history in the stories they tell and the lessons they learn when they're children. And you have generations of people who have grown up being told stories of separatism, of separate identity, of antagonism, and so on. History is woven into the texture of life in Northern Ireland. We'll come to the parades, the marches, the celebrations of battles of the 17th century and things. I mean, it really, really matters, and it cannot simply be put aside or wished away. I mean, and that's one of the lessons of this story, that continuity kind of gives you a context that people find it very difficult to escape, I suppose.
But also that politicians in London view this with a kind of frustrated sense of bafflement, which is kind of what Churchill is saying there. You know, nothing has changed.
No, exactly. And in fact, the longer time goes on, and the more that the Irish question, as it were, which had been so big in the late 19th century, the more that it recedes, the less that people in London understand it. So by the time you get to the 60s and 70s, you have a generation of politicians in London. Take someone like James Callaghan. We'll talk about him later on. He was the grandson of somebody who had left Ireland in the famine, but his family had ended up converting from Catholicism to baptism. Does James Callaghan understand Ireland? No, not really. He's not really interested in it. It's something that happened a long time ago to him. But to people in Belfast, this is kind of living history. It's real.
Yeah.
And the fact that the British don't understand it is enraging to them because it matters so much to them.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the state of Northern Ireland. All this fighting in the early 20s had two obvious consequences. First of all, if you're part of the 1/3 Catholic minority, you do not regard this state as a safe space by any means. It's actually a very unsafe space for you.
Is there emigration?
There is some emigration. Yes, there are thousands of people who cross the border
to the Republic.
Again, by the standards of European population transfers of the 20s, it's not enormous, but it's not nothing. You know, there are people who definitely move south because they think this is going to be a very unwelcoming place for us.
And Protestants moving from the south to the north?
Not so much. More so that Protestants, I think, would move from the south to Britain.
Right, okay.
You know, people who lived in the big houses, the Anglo-Irish kind of Protestant ascendancy and so on. So obviously, if you're a Catholic, there are loads of families who sort of bear the scars, sometimes physically, of the fighting. There are a lot of people, actually later on, who were involved in the IRA or whatever in the 60s and 70s, who had parents and grandparents who told them stories about what happened in 1920 or 1921. But then for Protestants, for the Protestant majority, they don't regard this as an entirely safe space either, because although they're a majority in their own state, they are not a majority on the island. They feel we're surrounded by Catholics, we're besieged by Catholics, there is a state to the south that aspires to a united Ireland, so that wishes us ill and wants to destroy our state. That's how they see it. And they say, we've also got this fifth column inside our own borders. We've got, a third of our population are Catholics and we can't trust them.
And is there anxiety at this stage about the demographic potential of Catholic families tending to have more children than Protestant families? Which is a kind of, people talk about that a lot now. But was it an issue back then?
People talked about it a lot. They talked about it a lot throughout the 20th century. So Terence O'Neill, who was the Northern Ireland Prime Minister in the 60s, made a very contentious speech at the end of the decade when he said, this was regarded as him being too soft by a lot of unionists. He said, we should treat the Catholics more nicely because they have loads and loads of children. And if we treat them more nicely, they will behave better and they will have fewer children. They won't overtake us demographically. Basically, nobody liked this speech.
There's quite a lot to unpick there.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that. But yeah, absolutely. People often would talk about that. I don't think it's that they feel demographically we're going to be overwhelmed very quickly. What they feel is the people in Dublin want to undermine us, which a lot of them, frankly, do. They think, they look south and they say, well, this newly, effectively autonomous and going to be independent Ireland is turning itself into a kind of Catholic-run state with the church having overweening power. This is the one thing we dread. We don't want this. And we have all these people within our own borders who we don't think we can trust, who would like to, undermine us. So that's why, there's a defensiveness that gives you the slogan, no surrender, which is, of course, one of Ian Paisley's favourite phrases, isn't it?
Yeah.
So those tensions. So they're there in the 20s. And then when most people in Britain tell the story, they sort of stop there and they say, well, let's fast forward to the 1960s because nothing happens in between. But that's actually dead wrong. Lots of stuff happens in between. It's just we don't ever learn about it in Britain. So, for example, in 1935, I mean, this will surprise loads of people. There is massive rioting in Belfast. There are gun battles. There are snipers on the top of buildings. British troops have to be sent to clear the streets with armoured cars. 11 people are killed, 100 people are injured, 2,000 people are driven out of their homes. And then actually that inspired reprisals across the Irish border. So there were attacks on Protestant homes and shops in Limerick. There were burnings of Church of Ireland churches and Methodist chapels in rural Ireland and so on and so forth. And in the background, the whole time, the Irish Republican Army. So, there's been all this stuff in the 1910s and 1920s with the IRA. The IRA had split in Southern Ireland. It had, in what became the Republic, it had fought a civil war. The IRA never went away. It's still there all this time. So most IRA men, once the British signed the treaty and the civil war was over, they did go home. They put their guns away. That was an end to it. But not all of them did. So at any given point, there are still a few hundred active IRA men with guns, and that is still enough to kill people. And they do kill people. So in January 1939, again, most people in Britain don't know this happened. In January 1939, the IRA launched a new campaign against Britain, and they called it the S Plan, the sabotage plan. And when you go, I mean, it's astounding how little known this is when you go through what happened. There were bombs in London, in Birmingham, Bristol, in Liverpool, in Blackpool, all over. There were bomb attacks on railway stations, banks, post office. There were bombs on the London Underground. Most notoriously, there was a bicycle bomb in Coventry city centre in August 1939 that killed 5 people, the youngest of whom was 50 and the oldest 82.
I mean, I suppose that further developments in Coventry city centre the following year have slightly obliterated the memory of that bomb.
Yeah, of course. Isn't it funny that Coventry is obviously bombed by the Germans? Everyone remembers that. So this 1939 bombing, which otherwise would be very, very well known.
Very salient, yeah.
Is basically been wiped from our national consciousness. But what happened to the IRA? In World War II, both the British and the Irish governments massively cracked down, and they started interning IRA suspects without trial. Ireland actually executed 6 IRA men during the Second World War, including the chief of staff of the IRA. They executed him for killing a guard, an Irish policeman. So the Irish are just as tough on the IRA as the British are. Now, against this background, the people who run Northern Ireland, the Unionists, have absolutely no intention of loosening their grip. And the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland was called Sir James Craig. If you Google him, he really does look like a boiled egg and someone has painted a face on him.
Does he have a massive moustache?
He does have a moustache, yeah.
Of course he does. I mean, with a name like Sir James Craig, you couldn't not.
He undoubtedly has a moustache, yeah, no question. So he was very explicit about this. He gave a speech in the 1930s. He said, I'm not going to do the accent because my Northern Irish accent is not as good as yours. He said, in the South, they boast of being a Catholic state. All I boast of is that we are a Protestant parliament and a Protestant state.
That's good, Dominic.
Thank you. It's understated, though, it's a bit wobbly. He's not wrong. They are a Protestant state. The judges, the magistrates, the civil servants are almost entirely Protestant. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, the police, who are going to play a massive part in this story, they're about 9-1 Protestant. And the RUC has an armed kind of paramilitary reserve called the B Specials that people sign up for. And these are exclusively Protestant, really. They are the sort of the bulwark, the enforcers of unionist supremacy. When things kick off in the streets, you call for the B Specials and they come out of their Orange Order lodges with their guns, and they are the people who will basically restore order.
So in the 70s and 80s, the comparison was often made between Northern Ireland and South Africa by nationalists and Republicans. But I mean, there's kind of an element of truth there, isn't there? To a degree.
It's a very inflammatory comparison.
I mean, if the entire apparatus of the state is controlled by one faction, then it's not, I mean, there's no way you could describe it as a properly functioning democracy.
No, you absolutely couldn't. We'll come on to this. You absolutely couldn't.
And it's overtly sectarian. If not, I mean, it's not racist, but it's sectarian.
It's not racist. It is a sectarian state. Exactly. And Sir James Craig or somebody like that would say, I mean, he might quibble with the word sectarian, but he would say, we're a Protestant state. End of story. If you don't like it, go somewhere else. This is how we're going to run things. We know what we're doing. Pipe down. He would absolutely say that. And critics would say, well, that's what the Afrikaners or whatever say in South Africa. Some people in Northern Ireland would be offended by that. Some people would lean into that comparison and say, well, we kind of are like the Boers. We are hardy frontiersmen. We've carved out a state in the face of overwhelming odds. We've built something really precious and special, and we want to defend it. And don't you tell us what to do.
I don't want to plunge into this because it's murky waters, but on the Shankill and Falls Road murals, the Shankill is full of the Israeli flag and the Falls Road is full of the Palestinian flag.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. Yes. There is a self-image. The Unionists, especially some years ago, would have said, we are like the chosen people. We're like the children of God, the children of Zion, all of that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, Ian Paisley definitely would have done.
Ian Paisley undoubtedly would. And of course, among nationalists, the comparison with the Palestinians, goes back to the 70s. So absolutely, yes. Two things about the IUC, the police, which is important for people to remember. Number one, they are much, much more powerful than a police force in Britain or elsewhere in Western Europe. There was special legislation in 1922 that gave them special powers. They can search without a warrant. They can arrest you without a warrant. They can intern you as a suspect without trial. They can impose a curfew, a ban on a march, or a ban on a newspaper at will. So they have a lot of leeway. And the RUC, like their political masters, are very closely tied to a group called the Orange Order. And the Orange Order is basically a fraternal organization, a fraternity, a brotherhood. It was founded in 1795. It was dedicated to the defense of Protestantism and the union with Britain. It's, of course, named after William of Orange from the Glorious Revolution. And almost every single member of the B Special Reserves and almost every single Unionist MP is an Orangeman, belongs to an Orange Lodge. So, where does that leave you if you're a Catholic? In 1967, the Times did a big investigation into the status of Catholics in Northern Ireland, and it described them as Ulster's second-class citizens. And actually, you can see why. So the Ulster Unionist leader, David Trimble, who ended up winning the Nobel Prize, didn't he? In 1998, in his Nobel Prize-winning speech, said that Ulster Unionists, fearful of being isolated on the island, built a solid house, but it was a cold house for Catholics, which was a sort of a big concession for an Ulster Unionist leader to have said. And he was right. A lot of Protestant firms will not employ Catholics. If you have a Catholic name, if your name was, I don't know, Liam O'Hara or something, you probably would not get a job. You wouldn't even be interviewed for a job, given a chance of a job in the big Harland and Wolff shipyards. Roman Catholics are twice as likely to be unemployed as Protestants, and they have no political power, really, because Northern Ireland has a first-past-the-post political system in which the boundaries have been ruthlessly gerrymandered to ensure a permanent unionist majority at Stormont at the Parliament. This is even more glaring at the local level. At the local level, you can only vote if you're a ratepayer, if you pay local government rates. And you pay them if you own your own house or if you rent a house, or you can vote if you're the spouse of somebody who, the wife usually, of somebody who owns or rents a house. Now, Catholics are poorer. They're more likely to live in extended family groups or with their parents. And as a result, lots of Catholics can't vote in local elections. As a result of that, in the cities or the places where you have, a Catholic majority, so the city of Derry or County Tyrone or County Fermanagh, power is still controlled by the Unionists because they have more people who own their own homes. And that means they control public jobs and, crucially, housing. It may sound very banal, but it's a massive deal in this story. Because the housing stock in Northern Ireland is terrible. It's Victorian, it's crumbling. 1 in 3 houses either doesn't have running water or it doesn't have a flushing toilet. So young couples in particular, they want to get out of their parents' kind of crumbling Victorian terrace and they want a new home of their own. But because giving people a home means giving them votes, Unionist councils don't like giving homes to Catholics because it gives them 2 more votes, right? Husband and wife, if it's a young couple. So they don't like building homes in Catholic areas.
Right, yeah.
The chairman of Enniskillen Housing Committee, 1963, we're going to see that the right people are put in these houses. We're not going to apologise for it. Now, it does work the other way around. So in nationalist councils like Newry, they built lots of new houses in the early 60s and they gave only a tiny handful of them to Protestants. But the big losers from all this are the Catholics. And one place above all becomes emblematic of this. And this is the second city of Northern Ireland, a city in the far west of the country. It was originally a settlement called Derry. Then in 1613, a consortium of London guilds basically was set up to colonise the area. They built a new walled city. And because they were London guilds, they called it Londonderry. And hence you have the name controversy, which actually, in this period, the 60s...
Isn't really, is it? Everyone calls it Derry.
Everybody calls it Derry.
Yeah.
It only really became a big controversy once the Troubles kicked off. And then it became a kind of a point of pride to call it either Derry, like Paul Rouse, our former guest, or Londonderry, as you did in the General Post Office in Dublin. So we'll just call it Derry for short. Derry in 1965 or so is a 2-to-1 Catholic city. So 36,000 Catholics, 18,000 Protestants. But it's always been controlled by Protestants through gerrymandering. So they're always redrawing the boundaries of the wards to give themselves a majority on the council. So when I was thinking about this, I wondered whether you would say, surely the British government wouldn't stand for this. This is outrageous. But the truth, as we shall see, is the British have absolutely no interest in what happens in Northern Ireland at all.
I appreciate that. I'm just wondering if it is under British law illegal.
Good question. I don't think it is. Some Catholic solicitor would have undoubtedly taken it to court. It's not illegal, I think, because the councils set the boundaries. The councils decide the ward boundaries.
So this is the devolution that Andy Burnham wants back. The right of councils to gerrymander.
Right. Well, we shall see. Anyway, so to go back to Derry, basically almost every Protestant family who wants a house gets one, but there are 2,000 Catholic families on the waiting list for housing. And we will come back to this in the next episode because it is no accident that this is where the Troubles really kick off in earnest against this background. So just to finish by talking about the Catholics before we go to the break. Imagine, Tom, you're a young Catholic in the early 60s in Northern Ireland. What is your name?
Seamus O'Murphy.
Yeah, Seamus, whatever. Exactly. So you're identifiable by your name. You have no flat. You have no vote in local elections. You maybe don't have a job. You feel that the system is stacked against you, and it has been for the last 40 years. Where do you look for hope?
The Virgin Mary.
Yeah, you probably, well, maybe to the Virgin Mary, exactly. You might look to the sort of Northern Irish Nationalist Party, but they are very small. They're very ineffective. I mean, in 1962 and 1965, in the Stormont Parliament, they won 9 out of 52 seats. I mean, they're barely even an opposition, really. And they are generally seen as a bit old-fashioned, very Catholic, very rural, not terribly effective.
Kind of De Valera type.
A little bit, yeah. But De Valera is a very wily and ruthless politician, and they are not.
Right.
Then you have the IRA. Now, the unionist hardliners talk all the time about the IRA. You know, they're obsessed with the IRA. They say the IRA, you know, is always out there, which, to be fair, it kind of is. The IRA had rebuilt after the Second World War, and it had launched a new guerrilla campaign along the border in 1956 called Operation Harvest. And this campaign had been a complete and utter disaster. Both Belfast and Dublin, in fact, Eamon de Valera, reintroduced internment without trial. They interned loads of IRA people and they completely broke the back of the organisation. And so in 1962, the IRA had called off this campaign. They dumped a lot of their weapons and madly, a few years later, they sold a lot of their weapons to the Welsh.
Oh.
To the Free Wales Army.
Great. So people thinking this is just about Ireland. It's about Wales as well.
There's actually too much Welsh history. So much Welsh history and the rest is history.
It just keeps going. I know.
Yeah. They're everywhere. It's unbelievable. Right. So the IRA gets a new chief of staff who's from Dublin called Cathal Goulding. And Goulding says, listen, we have been wasting our time here. This has been a terrible mistake. And he said later, the notion that the IRA was going to rise up someday and free Ireland and get rid of the British was a ridiculous pipe dream. I mean, that's a hell of a thing for the guy running the IRA to say in the early 60s. And this bloke Goulding, he's actually very close to some Marxist academics and to people from the British Communist Party. And they persuade him the IRA's future lies in socialist activism.
So he's listening to the British.
He's listening to British academics, I know, which is mad.
Never listened to a British academic.
Instead of like blowing up post offices and stuff, why don't we work to build a non-sectarian workers' alliance that will fight both imperialism and capitalism? And the people who were running the IRA in the 60s said, yeah, actually, brilliant, let's do that. Because, of course, that goes with the momentum of the 60s, right? It feels right.
Yeah, of course. So do they start going to conferences and goldsmiths?
They do. There's probably men with polo necks. They have a lot of seminars. Yeah. There's a lot of talking shops about smashing capitalism. They're massively into this. Now, if you're an older IRA veteran, you are not pleased about this at all. So a lot of older IRA men are culturally conservative Catholics. They are not Marxists. So Joe Cahill, who was an IRA veteran who had been jailed for killing a policeman in 1942, he said, the movement was being led off the true path of republicanism. Ultra-left politics were taking over. Sooner or later, there would have to be a showdown. And he's right, and there will be a showdown.
I mean, people say that Sinn Féin are doing the same at the moment, that they're becoming Corbynist, really.
Exactly, that they're sort of caught between, you know, this Catholic nationalism on the one hand and a slightly woolly
Marxist internationalism.
Yes, on the other. Now, we'll come back to this later in the series, but the point really is that they've gone very, very quiet. So a future member of the Provisional IRA, Billy McKee's quote from him, I believed that it was dead, completely dead, and it was, except in the minds of myself and other old Republicans. So, to return to the original question, if you're a Catholic, where are you looking for help? There is an alternative, of course. You could look to Dublin. Now, in theory, the Republic of Ireland claims the whole island. Article 2 of the Irish Constitution, the national territory consists of the whole island of Ireland. And Irish politicians would always say, if they're asked, well, our goal, of course, is unification of the entire island. In reality, since the 1920s, governments in Dublin have shown no interest in advancing this at all and done absolutely nothing about it. And again, this is something that will surprise, I think, a lot of listeners. Twice in the Second World War, the British said to the government in Dublin, we will give you a united Ireland if you abandon your neutrality and join the Allies. After Pearl Harbor in 1941, Winston Churchill sent an incredible telegram to Eamon de Valera. Now is your chance, now or never, a nation once again. So the nation once again is a kind of Republican slogan. Churchill was using it. And de Valera just completely ignored him. Didn't want to abandon neutrality. And also, of course, if you are a politician in Dublin, you don't really want those 1 million Protestants who have a tendency to sign covenants and join volunteer groups to fight you.
I mean, that's an issue right the way up to the present, really, isn't it?
To the present, exactly, of course. So in 1959, de Valera, the great champion of Irish independence and Irish republicanism, retired as Taoiseach, became president of Ireland, kind of kicked upstairs, and he was succeeded by a man called Sean Lemass.
I mean, it's unbelievable he's called Lemass.
I know.
I mean, anything more calculated to alarm Ian Paisley than Lemass.
We shall come to this. Lemass had fought in the Easter Rising and he'd also been in the IRA. But in private, Lemass said to people, come on, the island's going to be partitioned for a long time yet. Like, there's no point in whinging about this. It's not going to change anytime soon. So Dublin's not really interested in the Catholics in Northern Ireland. And if they're not really interested, people who are even less interested are politicians in London. Now, there are some Labour MPs. There are always Labour MPs who campaign against discrimination against the Catholics. So this goes back to your point, Tom. How could this happen in Britain?
Well, I kind of think, I mean, it's a massive blot on the British state that it's allowing this to happen, I think.
But the British state, first of all, it's running an empire for most of this period. So, I mean, it's not like there aren't other places where there are, you know, interesting local arrangements.
But by the mid-60s.
Yes, and people in the 60s start to say this. So you have a Labour backbench what's it called? The Campaign for Democracy in Ulster that kicks off in the mid-60s. You have newspapers like the Times, the Sunday Times, the Guardian, drawing attention to this and saying it's kind of not right that these people don't get houses and they don't really get to vote in local elections and stuff like this. But here's why people don't get massively excited about it. Ever since the 1920s, most British politicians have worked on the assumption that the Irish question, which had dogged Britain for so long, has been solved. It's done. It's finished. The people in the north, we fixed it because they've got their own parliament. We'll just let them get on with it. It's not perfect, but we absolutely don't want to interfere because they have a tendency to start arming themselves and we don't want to stir them up again. What has happened in Britain is that Northern Ireland has vanished from the national consciousness. It virtually never appears in the newspapers. It's never mentioned in TV bulletins, news bulletins. Most people never think about it at all. I mentioned Jim Callaghan before. Jim Callaghan, grandson of Irish immigrant. And I quote, "Most members of parliament knew less about it than we knew about our distant colonies on the far side of the earth." And I think that's true. There's loads in British newspapers about Cyprus in the 1950s. There's loads about Kenya. There's loads about Malaysia. There's virtually nothing about Northern Ireland. And actually, people think, well, what's the point? Nothing's ever going to change. The Unionists hold every single Westminster seat. The Nationalists are totally irrelevant. The IRA have been beaten. And frankly, most people in Northern Ireland, they might be Protestant, they might be Catholic, but this is the 60s. It's the affluent society. They're more interested in buying a new TV or a new washing machine than they are about refighting the battles of the past.
So this is the Sandbrook perspective.
Well, that would be the Sandbrook perspective, and I would be wrong.
All about washing machines.
In this instance, my washing machine-eccentric view of history would be absolutely discredited because everybody thinks life is going to go on, everything is going to be the same forever and ever, and they are wrong because things are about to change very dramatically indeed.
And Dominic, we will find out how and why after a break.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Tom, throughout history, change has often been driven by businesses and institutions that end up having a massive impact on society as a whole. And there's probably no better example than the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford and his managers revolutionized production through their pioneering assembly lines, and they influenced factories and working practices in countries all over the world.
Another example of a business driving technological and social change is Amazon, which is increasing the number of its electric vehicles used for deliveries in Europe to over 10,000 by the end of this year, 2026.
Now, on top of that, over 50% of Amazon deliveries now come with less packaging or sometimes no added packaging at all. It helps to avoid unnecessary waste and it makes recycling at home that much easier. Find out more at amazon.co.uk/sustainability.
There have been disappointments and frustrations, but progress has been so marked that there is no excuse for pessimism about the future. The 6 counties, unlike their neighbours across the border, belong to the British welfare state. They share too, as they richly deserve, many of the fruits of the affluent society. The processes of modernisation have been carried far, and they are not halted. On the contrary, they are on the march. So welcome back to The Rest is History, and that ringingly optimistic, groovy 60s perspective was in the Times on the 12th of April 1965, looking ahead to a bright new future for Northern Ireland. Great to see the Times with its finger on the pulse.
Always.
The paper for top people. And I suppose that top people sitting in their gentlemen's clubs, reading those words, it would have seemed beyond the bounds of possibility to them that within a few years there would be bombs going off everywhere on the streets of Belfast and Derry, British soldiers patrolling those streets, hundreds of people being killed every year, and the carnage of it all spreading to the British mainland.
Yeah.
So what goes wrong? I mean, what happens?
What happens? But big question. That's what the series is all about, Tom. So let's start on the 25th of March, 1963. So this is the day that Captain Terence O'Neill becomes the 4th Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. So 1963, Harold Macmillan is Prime Minister in Britain. The Beatles are about to launch their great assault on the charts. They're only months away from going to America. The swinging 60s are kind of poised to happen, all of this. And Northern Ireland is going to get an exciting, dynamic, modernising new Prime Minister. And this is Captain O'Neill. So Captain O'Neill is almost 50 years old. His father was an Ulster Unionist. His father was the first MP to be killed in the First World War. He was born in London, brought up in London. He went to Eton. He spent his summers in Northern Ireland. He served in a tank brigade in the Second World War. 2 of his brothers were killed in the war, but he wasn't. And afterwards, he became an Ulster Unionist MP, as his father had before him. And then he rose to become Northern Ireland's Minister of Finance. And then in 1963, the party grandees, they chose him to succeed the elderly Lord Brookborough as Prime Minister. Now, O'Neill knows that when he takes the reins, he's facing a big challenge. But in his mind, that challenge is primarily economic. So in our previous series, when we talked about Ireland, or indeed when we did the Titanic, we talked about how Belfast was different from other cities in Ireland. It's made of brick, not stone. It feels like a northern English city transplanted across the Irish Sea. It's an industrial powerhouse. It makes all its linen in the mills, and it's got its shipyards, and it's got chimneys and smoke and the sound of hammers and all of that kind of thing. And of course, that's brilliant if you're in 1900. But if you're in 1963, this is the kind of place that's going to be left behind by the harsh winds of global competition. Even in the 50s, jobs in textiles and shipbuilding had been shrinking dramatically, and unemployment was going up. And unemployment was already higher than in the rest of Britain, and earnings lower than in the rest of Britain. So if you're an Ulster Unionist, this has political consequences, because you look at the electoral map, and there's a slow, steady advance of a Northern Irish Labour Party that's appealing to kind of working class people and saying, times are tough. We're going to better represent you than the old stuck-up Unionist grandees. And so for Terence O'Neill, he thinks, well, my priority is to revive the Northern Irish economy by getting new investment. And I'm going to look abroad for that investment. I'm going to get multinational companies, Michelin, Ford, ICI, these big names. They'll come to Northern Ireland because our labour costs are cheaper. But there are 2 issues with this. Issue number 1. Most of this happens in Belfast or the east of the country, the places that are more urbanised and have better transport links with the island of Great Britain. But in the west, which is more heavily Catholic, where unemployment is already higher, these companies don't want to invest there. So these places feel like they're being left behind. And people there say, well, Terence O'Neill talks a good game, but he only cares about the Protestants in the East. He doesn't care about us at all. But then the other thing, the sort of more counterintuitive thing about all this new investment, it's very disruptive to Northern Ireland's existing arrangements. Because if you're, Ford or Michelin or something, and you arrive, you're like people from Mad Men or something. Yeah. You've got a kind of sharp suit. You like a graph and a table and all that stuff. You've got all these time and motion studies. And then people say to you, well, we'll be wearing our bowler hats and we'll be going on a big march. And obviously we can't have any Catholics. You stare at them in stupefaction and disbelief and you say, well, that's not, the Ford Motor Company does not operate that way or whatever.
Get with it.
Exactly. And so there's a degree of tension between the newcomers, the new investment, the new companies, and then the people who basically are like, come on, we spend our evenings always at the Orange Lodge and we sing our songs about the Glorious Revolution. Now, this would not have been insuperable for a sort of populist politician, for a more skillful communicator to handle. But Terence O'Neill is not that man. As we said, he's an old Etonian. He's married to an English woman. And he has an English accent because he's been brought up in London. And so, although he goes down quite well with the kind of country landowners, because he's very posh, the poorer, more conservative, working class Protestants, they see him as soft and as stuck up and as somebody who's totally oblivious to their concerns. So I already mentioned David Trimble, leader of the Ulster Unionists in the 1990s. He said of Terence O'Neill, he never spoke or behaved as if he was one of us. Which is, I think, true.
He has a slight look of the former editor of the Daily Telegraph.
Yeah.
Charles Moore.
And like Charles Moore is the head of the Rectory Society or something. He loves an old rectory.
Yes.
And I believe Terence O'Neill lived in a Regency rectory. And that's a very bad sign in a person. Is it not?
Never trust a man who owns a Regency rectory.
No, they're terrible people. So Terence O'Neill also lacks natural political skills. He's very aloof. He's very shy. He's cold. One of his own ministers said he was distant and uninspiring. I would not have felt like dying in a ditch for him. And I don't think that's ideal. You know, it's not an unfamiliar. I mean, we've had prime ministers like that. In fact, quite recently, we've had a couple of prime ministers like that. But it's not the ideal type for this moment. So actually, after a couple of years, more conservative Protestants are beginning to wonder whether O'Neill is really the man for the job after all. And he keeps doing things that worry them. So, for example, in 1965, he became the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland to welcome the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland. This is Sean Lemass. Now, Terence O'Neill said, well, it's good to have this bloke Lemass here because we want to build bridges with our neighbours. We want to build bridges with the Republic. And one of his critics, who was a Presbyterian minister, said, a bridge and a traitor are very much alike, for they both go over to the other side. And the name of the man who said this, the Reverend Ian Paisley. So he's back in the show. So Paisley is really an incredible character. I did worry that he would slightly take over this episode, and maybe that would be no bad thing. He is this colossal figure in the life of Northern Ireland. He goes from the most sort of strident demagoguery to power sharing in the 1990s and 2000s, which just seems absolutely bonkers as a trajectory. And like everyone else in this story, he is profoundly shaped by history. So he's born in Armagh in 1926. His father was a Baptist minister, and his father had served in Sir Edward Carson's volunteers. And Ian Paisley himself becomes a Baptist minister, and he preached his first sermon when he was 16.
Wow.
He's a massive bloke. He's like 6'4" or something.
Do you know what? He looks brilliant in a dog collar. Really, it really suits him. I think dog collars, when they're around a scrawny neck, look a bit weedy. But with him, he looks like a Celtic warrior with a torque. I mean, he probably wouldn't like that comparison, actually.
Yeah. He could look like a Saxon warrior with the torque. Maybe he might take that. I don't know. Or a Scottish warrior, I suppose. So it's this firebrand fundamentalist style. In 1951, he set up his own kind of Calvinist church, the Free Presbyterian Church of Ulster. He believes in the literal truth of the Bible. He thinks the established churches of Ulster, which strike most observers as quite hardline conservative churches, but he thinks they are weak, soft, Romish sellouts. There's an obvious parallel, of course, with Southern evangelical preachers in the United States. And later in his life, he does forge very strong links with Bob Jones University in South Carolina.
Bob Jones University.
Are you aware of Bob Jones University?
No.
You're not?
No.
Bob Jones University is a big deal because Bob Jones University was an anti-Catholic, ultra-Protestant university, evangelical. I can't remember when it was set up, but George W. Bush went and gave a speech there in 2000 when he was campaigning for the Republican nomination.
Was it set up by a guy called Bob Jones? Or did they just... Let's think of a funny name.
Bob Jones, you laugh at Bob Jones University and you're foolish to do so. It has 3,000 students. It has an endowment of $20 million. And the current chancellor, Bob Jones III.
Well, I take it all back. I apologize to Bob Jones.
So anyway, Ian Paisley forged links with Bob Jones University. And so there's a sort of, there are lots of Southern evangelicals who love Ian Paisley. His calling card, rather like that of Bob Jones actually, is absolutely red hot, evangelical, old-fashioned anti-Catholicism. And if people enjoy anti-Catholic rhetoric, this podcast is the place for it.
Should I do it?
You do it. Yeah, I think you should do it because you do the voice.
Through popery, the devil has shut up the way to our inheritance. Priestcraft, superstition, and papalism, with all their attendant vices of murder, theft, immorality, lust, and incest, have blocked the way to the land of gospel liberty.
That's
yeah.
That's
good. That's
his take.
That is. I mean, it's a view. Now, People may have raised their eyebrows there about when he's talking about priestcraft and its attendant voices of murder and whatnot, but also lust and incest.
He takes it very literally, doesn't he?
Yeah. Now, there's a lot of talk of lust and incest in Ian Paisley's sermons. He loves all this. So in his first prayer meetings, he used to, like sort of Jack in the Box, a nun would pop up and he would say, this nun has escaped from a Catholic convent and she was the victim of sexual overtures from monks and other nuns. And I have rescued her and she has seen the light and she's going to tell us all about the evils of Catholicism. He had his own newspaper, the Protestant Telegraph, some of its headlines. Priestly murders exposed, children tortured, monks turned out as sadists. Or probably my favourite thing that he said, when the moderator of the Church of Scotland made a cordial visit to the Pope, the headline in the Protestant Telegraph was, "The Church of Scotland, drunk with the wine of the fornication with the Roman whore." And of course, it's easy for us to mock, and it's very easy, and that's what we have been doing. But in Northern Ireland, where religious identity is so important, this finds a ready audience. And he's a brilliant, brilliant speaker.
I mean, that is the thing, isn't he?
Yeah.
There is a power to those tones.
Totally there is.
He's speaking with the timbre of John Fox, and there's a kind of magnificent rhetorical role to it.
But you know who would agree with you? Somebody very unexpected. The actor Liam Neeson. I will find you and I will kill you. You know, that guy.
Yeah, he was an early impression.
Very early impression. He was born from a Catholic family. He was from County Antrim, but he was inspired by Ian Paisley to become an actor. He would go to see Ian Paisley at his gospel hall, and he said afterwards, you could see this extraordinary performance, the charisma that he had. It was electrifying. And loads of people talk about this. So a man we'll be talking about a little bit later, one of Paisley's protégés, a guy called Noel Doherty. He was a teenage fundamentalist, he became a printer, and then he became a loyalist paramilitary. He said, I was spellbound by his oratory. I felt this is a man that is doing the Lord's work, and I'm going to do it with him. I saw him as a great Ulsterman and a second Carson. Again, harking back to the history of the early 1910s. Now, in 60s Britain, people laughed at Ian Paisley and they said he's bonkers, he's a clown, he's a freak, he's a relic or whatever. But actually, we have done so many people like this on this show. Different time periods, Savonarola, the Ayatollah Khomeini, imposing, charismatic, striking, rhetorically brilliant speakers who have a gift for giving these electrifying addresses that channel the anxieties of their listeners.
Well, I mean, it might sound shocking, but Martin Luther King on the progressive side.
Yeah, a brilliant speaker.
I mean, again, using the potency of biblical rhetoric.
And like a lot of these people, Khomeini is a good example. Always dresses the same way. Ian Paisley has a costume. He's got a flair for publicity. So in this period, he always wears a black suit. He wears his white clerical collar, which you liken to a talk. And he had something that he doesn't really persist with in later life, which is he has this trademark raincoat. Because the 60s is a great age for a coat.
Is it a Ganex raincoat?
I don't think it's Ganex like Harold Wilson's. It's more old-fashioned than that. It's this huge, because he's so massive, it's this massive, like, white belted coat that he always wears.
He does sometimes wear Orangeman's sash, doesn't he?
Oh yeah, he'll wear an orange sash when the time calls for it. And he's very good at publicity stunts that are very attractive to the newspapers and they look good on TV. So to give you some of his stunts, he first really came to public attention in 1956. He rescued a 15-year-old Catholic girl called Maura Lyons. Maura Lyons had decided she wanted to join Ian Paisley's church and her parents forbade it. So he and his supporters smuggled her to Scotland. This was a massive story. I mean, they basically kidnapped this teenager and he was absolutely unrepentant. He called a big rally. Whenever he's in trouble, he calls a rally in the Ulster Hall in Belfast. And he said, they're saying I'm going to have to go to prison. I would be proud to do time for Protestant liberty. Like he always says this kind of thing. That was actually Richard Nixon's voice. 2 years later, the Queen, he condemns, he loves putting the boot into the British when they let the side down. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret made a courtesy call to Pope John the 23rd. He said of them, They've been committing spiritual fornication and adultery with the Antichrist. I mean, accusing the Queen Mother of fornication and adultery is strong stuff, I think, especially with the Antichrist.
It would get you in the papers, wouldn't it?
It would.
Saying stuff like that.
Or when the Pope died in 1963, Terence O'Neill, a conciliatory gesture, said, "We will lower the Union Jack as a mark of respect, because after all, 1 in 3 of our citizens is actually a Catholic." Paisley went absolutely berserk at this. He said, "I can't stand the lying eulogies now being paid to the Roman Antichrist by the Iscariots of Ulster." He said, "The good news, though," he said, "the Romish man of sin is now in hell."
Well, that's something.
Do you remember in the 80s, he disrupted the European Parliament?
Yeah, he did. There was lots about the Antichrist and the Whore of Babylon and stuff.
He was an MEP at this point, wasn't he? Was he not? And the Pope John Paul II, came to address the European Parliament, and Ian Paisley was bundled out of the hall, shouting, "I denounce you as Antichrist."
He had massive jowls by that point, and they would kind of wobble all over his chest.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we come to the Westminster general election of 1964. And this really is the politics of Northern Ireland in microcosm. So we're in West Belfast, which is historically, of the city's 4 seats, the most competitive, because it contains the heavily Catholic Falls Road, which you mentioned earlier. And one of the candidates was a guy called Liam Macmillan, who was an IRA man. He'd been active in the border campaign, and he is standing as an independent Republican. And in the window of his election office in the Lower Falls, he hangs this big Irish tricolour flag. Now, under the Stormont Flags and Emblems Act of 1954, the RUC are empowered to take down any flags that they think are likely to provoke a breach of the peace. And this legislation was aimed specifically at people flying the Irish flag. But the police aren't completely stupid. When people fly it in Catholic areas, they generally leave it alone. Just let them get on with it if that's what they want to do. Paisley is horrified by this. He calls a big rally and he says, "I do not accept that any part of Ulster is Republican. I do not want to see the tricolour flying here." And under this pressure, the RUC decide, fine, we'll take it down. So on the 28th of September, a group of heavily armed police constables smash down the door of this bloke's office, and they carry off the flag through a crowd of 2,000 people who were sort of jeering at them and throwing stones at them and stuff. And this kicked off the worst rioting in Ulster since the 1930s. In some ways, you could say this is a possible departure point for the Troubles. There are thousands of people throwing stones and petrol bombs. People set a trolley bus on fire. And it ends with hundreds of RUC men armed with batons, supported by armoured cars and water cannons, physically clearing the Falls Road. And 50 people end up in hospital, as well as 18 RUC constables. And there's also copycat rioting, or sort of tit-for-tat rioting, by the way, in Dublin. There's a crowd, when they hear this, they assemble outside the British Embassy, and they have to be held back by the Irish police, and they're kind of throwing stones at them. And this is the first point, really, since the war, that the British papers almost noticed Northern Ireland. So the Times, there is a sickening familiarity about all of this, it says. "Let's hope we're not returning to the bitterness and savagery of the orange and green vendetta." But from Paisley's point of view, this has been very effective. It's got his name in the newspapers once again. He's made a stand. The Irish flag has come down. He is the champion of Protestant liberty, as he would call it. And 2 weeks later, when the Unionist candidate Jim Kilfedder wins West Belfast, he makes a point in his speech of thanking Ian Paisley for his support. So that sets the scene for 2 years in which Ian Paisley is becoming ever more strident in his attacks on what he sees as the soft, weak, English, untrustworthy Terence O'Neill. So the visit of Sean Lamass from Dublin. This is when Ian Paisley is going around shouting, "No mass, no Lamass." And then he gets an even better gift a year later. It's going to be the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising. And you said yourself, on the Falls Road, there are all the murals to this day of the Easter Rising. They make a big deal of it. Of course, 1916, if you're a Unionist, is the year of the Somme. So it's like a history war, I guess, being played out in the streets of Belfast. O'Neill says, fine, let the Catholics if they want to have a march to celebrate the Easter Rising 50 years on, of course we'll let them do it. It would be mad not to. It'll just create great tension if we ban it. Paisley is horrified by this. He tells a rally that by allowing this nationalist march, O'Neill is supporting murder, treason, and sedition. Our forefathers suffered from bullets and bombs and won. We will do the same. You know, Ian Paisley loves very violent rhetoric. Then there's another confrontation, June 1966. This time he's attacking the mainstream churches. So the mainstream Presbyterian Church are holding their annual assembly. Paisley decides to lead 1,500 supporters to attack them for their Romanizing tendencies, as he puts it. Basically, you could never be hard enough on Catholicism, I think, for the Reverend Ian Paisley. And he leads his supporters through this very Catholic area deliberately. They're attacked by local youths, and the melee ends with lots of stone throwing, fighting, people throwing bricks at the RUC, all of this kind of thing. The magistrates then order Paisley to sign a court order to keep the peace, a pledge to keep the peace. And he says, no, I'm not going to do that. And they sentenced him to 3 months in Crumlin Road prison. And that provoked yet more rioting, thousands of his supporters going on the rampage, chanting his name, people attacking Catholic-owned businesses, Catholic shops, and so on and so forth. And at this point, Terence O'Neill, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, says, okay, enough. I've lost patience. I'm banning all marches, Protestant or Catholic, for the next 3 months. The RUC have the power to shut down all meetings with more than 3 people in. You know, no more of this. And he gives a very, very outspoken speech at Stormont. And he says, Paisley and his supporters call themselves loyalists. But to whom are they loyal? To the Queen, whose personal representatives they revile? To the United Kingdom, in which their fellow citizens view their conduct with a mixture of ridicule and contempt? To Protestantism, many of whose leaders they have personally abused? I mean, it's good stuff. Mm-hmm. But O'Neill all the time is losing momentum. And it's Paisley who is attracting momentum. And part of this is the sort of ratchet effect of sectarian rhetoric. But it's also the economic context, the fact that people feel anxious about the future, the fact that Northern Ireland feels like it's a changing society and a lot of people don't like that, all of these kinds of things. And all the time, Paisley is attracting more recruits for his church and for its political wing, which was called Ulster Protestant Action. He had set this up, twofold reasons really. One, he'd said this will deter the IRA, but he also said we want to keep loyal workers in employment in times of deep depression. So there's an economic context to this too. But this is not the only group that he's associated with. There's a whole series of sort of a bewildering variety of factions and subgroups and whatnot. So I mentioned that he had a protege called Noel Docherty. In April 1966, with the anniversary of the Easter Rising coming, Docherty set up another group, a vigilante group, called the Ulster Protestant Volunteers. The stated aim of this group is, we think the IRA are going to launch an uprising on the anniversary of the Easter Rising, and we're going to be ready for them. We'll have cells all over Ulster, and they will rise up on command. The name, the Ulster Protestant Volunteers, obviously is to evoke Carson's Volunteers from 1912. The motto is the same, for God and Ulster. And like Carson's Volunteers, they really want to get a hold of guns. So Docherty recruits very heavily among the B Specials, the kind of police reservists, because they have been issued with revolvers and submachine guns, and they're allowed to keep their weapons at home. So this is a very useful thing for a paramilitary group. And Docherty said later, my aim was to have a private army just like Carson did with the signing of the Covenant. So Paisley would have had his own private army and he would have been a second Lord Carson.
Can I ask, Dominic, would the Protestants in Ulster at this point be ahead of the Catholics in terms of arming?
Well, given how many guns the B Specials have, I would say probably yes. And actually, when the IRA re-enter the story, let's say 1970, they don't have that many guns. And getting guns, Armalites, as they end up getting, becomes a real priority for them. Because, of course, they've made the cardinal error, which you should never do, of giving lots of guns to the Welsh.
Yes, of course. And the Welsh don't want to give them back.
Have you ever tried to reclaim a gun from a Welshman?
I can't say I have.
It's impossible. It can't be done.
Okay. Well, that is a mistake then.
Yeah. So anyway, Noel Docherty, this guy, is going round in the spring of 1966 trying to get guns and gelignite. And he comes into contact at this point with another loyalist vigilante group, that also looks back to Carson's volunteers. And this is a group called the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF. And it had been founded a few months earlier by a group of men who used to meet in the pubs in the working class Protestant Shankill area. And the chief among them, and a big figure in the story of the Troubles, although he's not so well known in Britain as some of the other figures, is a man called Gusty Spence, who was in his early 30s. Spence's father had been in Carson's volunteers. Spence's father had also served in the First World War. Spence himself had been in the British Army. He'd been in Cyprus. He came home to Belfast. He worked as a scaffolder at the Harland and Wolff shipyards. So he sort of ticks all of these different boxes.
Yeah.
Spence is a very hard man. He's no stranger to a brawl in a pub or something. He's a very keen member of the Orange Order. People look up to him because he's been in the army. There's a bit of an element, I think, about him and his friends of the old soldiers who are hanging around in the pub, talking about the old days, trying to find something to do. They want a cause, basically.
So in a way, that's kind of true of Mountbatten.
Yeah.
You know, all those kind of posh guys in the 70s wanting a military takeover.
General Sir Walter Walker, David Stirling, all of these people.
Yeah.
Yeah, they look back to the war or something and they say, God, that was brilliant. Wish we could have that back again. Instead of all these grubby political compromises and Harold Wilson's nasty raincoats, all of this. So I think with Gusty Spence and a lot of people like this, and this goes, by the way, for people on the Republican side, for people in the IRA, there was a sense of a romantic history of sort of outlaw violence and adventure and whatnot.
It's all about the songs and the fiddles.
And the stories and all of that kind of thing. And they are almost willing it back into being. Because at a time when, you know, jobs are scarce, life seems shabby and disappointing, this would give you a sense of excitement. And of course, if you ally that to the fear of the others, then that becomes a very potent combination.
The sense is that there is nothing inevitable about the Troubles.
People choose it.
People choose it. They, as you say, they will it into existence.
Yes. They absolutely do. And I think this search for a cause, and it's a cause that they're very familiar with, is a really important part of the story. Spence said later, there was still a sense, like with the old Ulster volunteers, that you were for the cause. You would fight and die for it. Yes, fight and die for the cause. And that's so widespread among the people who join the different paramilitary groups, whether Loyalist or Republican.
Fight and die and kill?
Well, this is the thing. So do you remember when we did the series about the Irish War of Independence with Paul Rouse? He said all the ballads are about fighting and dying, but people don't write ballads about fighting and killing, but someone's got to do the killing.
Yeah.
And actually, this brings us very neatly to May 1966 and arguably the first casualties of the Troubles. At this point, Spence and his pals have already started petrol bombing Catholic schools, Catholic shops, and so on. In their minds, they are deterring IRA vandalism. This is their excuse. Of course, an external observer would say this looks very much like kind of drunken sectarian vandalism and bullying to me. On the 7th of May, they decide to target a Catholic-owned pub just off the Shankill Road. They say, loads of Republicans hang out in this pub. We should blow this pub up. And they throw a petrol bomb through what they think is the landlord's window. But actually, it's the house next door. And it belongs to a Protestant grandmother called Matilda Gould, who was 77 years old. She was bedridden with severe arthritis. She can't get out of bed. She's horribly burned by this petrol bomb, and she dies 7 weeks later of her injuries. And a lot of accounts point to her as the first modern victim of the Troubles. And obviously this was a terrible mistake by the UVF to kill a Protestant grandmother. But in a sign of what's to come on both sides, they don't back down. They issue a statement 2 weeks later. From this day, we declare war against the IRA and its splinter groups. Known IRA men will be executed mercilessly and without hesitation. We solemnly warn the authorities to make no more speeches of appeasement. So there's two issues there. One is the sort of omnipresent, gnawing fear of the IRA that is there in Loyalist minds the whole time.
But the IRA are a shadow at this point.
They're very quiet at this point. I mean, a loyalist would say, come on, the IRA is still there, aren't they? And yes, they are still there, or even though they're not actively campaigning. But the other thing is the attack on the authorities for appeasement. You know, this rhetoric runs right through the 60s and 70s. And on the 27th of May, the UVF meet to discuss their next attack. They meet in a pub again. They say there's a bloke nearby called Leo Martin. He's a Republican activist. He's involved with the IRA. Let's go off and shoot him. And they go off to the Falls Road to go and find him, and they can't find him. And on the way back, having not found him, they see walking down the street towards them a bloke who's been in the pub all evening, who's singing Republican songs. He's called John Patrick Scullion. He's 28 years old. And they say, well, this bloke will do. And they stab him and they shoot him. And 2 weeks later, he dies in hospital of his wounds. And he's the second victim. And then a month later, a third victim. The evening of Saturday, the 25th of June, there are 4 young Catholics, 4 young blokes. They've been working in Belfast city centre, working late. They decide to go for a last pint at the Malvern Arms just off the Shankill Road because they know it stays open after hours. This pub, the Malvern Arms, is a Protestant pub. But one of these blokes says, it's fine. I know the landlord. This guy's called Andrew Kelly. He says, okay, I know the landlord. He'll have no problem with us going there. They get to the pub at about midnight. The pub is very busy. The landlord does know him. It's fine. They have no problem getting served. Great. They sit down with their pints. Unknown to them, by sheer bad luck, the drinkers at the next table are Gusty Spence and his gang. And one of the gang said to the police later, the conversation came up about the religion of these fellows. Spence asked the company if they would be Catholics. Spence then went up to the bar beside the 4 lads to buy a drink. When he returned to our table, he said, I've been listening to their conversation. They're 4 IRA men. They're IRA men. They will have to go.
Which they're not.
They're not IRA men. They're absolutely not. The 4 young Catholic guys have their pints. A couple of hours later, they leave the pub. And leading the way is one of them, Peter Ward, who is 18 years old. And as soon as they get outside, the shooting starts. Andrew Kelly again. He was dead, Peter Ward, when he hit the ground. I was shot too and I dropped down, but they kept on shooting at me. There were 4 gunmen. They didn't say anything. All I remember is the flashes and the shooting. So one of them, this guy Peter Ward, is killed. Spence and his gang were arrested and Spence and 2 others were sent to prison. Now, Paisley always condemns shootings of this kind. He's very happy to ratchet up the tension rhetorically, but he almost always distances himself from actual violence. And that, again, is something he's not unusual in that regard. There are loads of people in this story who are very happy to kind of stoke the flames, but when the bullets fly, they always say, oh no, I don't agree with this, of course.
Do you think that's a cynical take, or is he acting on genuine principle when he condemns it?
That is, I think, something that only
he would know.
He would know. If you're asking me my personal verdict, which not all listeners would agree with, I would say I think there's an awful amount of cynicism from people in this story. So I'm not just talking about Ian Paisley, I'm talking about Jerry Adams or whoever. There are an awful lot of people who say, I don't really support violence, I don't really encourage it, but everything that they do seems designed to encourage it because they believe it's in their political interests, frankly.
Okay.
So, yeah, I would take a very caustic view of such people personally. And actually, to go back, just to finish on Spence and Co., these killings were just so terrible to us. To some people, they give them a kind of outlaw appeal. They seem exciting. One writer later called Spence a loyalist folk hero. And there are lots of loyalist gunmen who joined paramilitary groups later who say, yes, he was my inspiration. I really looked up to this guy. He was the one person who had the guts to take up the gun and to actually do something positive to defend our people. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. In Britain, what do people think of all this? Do you know what? Most people don't even notice. This is the summer of swinging London. It's the summer of England's World Cup win. Most people are completely uninterested in Northern Ireland. It doesn't really fit the mood, these stories. Who cares that some people in a faraway place have been shooting each other if all your thoughts are of Carnaby Street and miniskirts and stuff? But of course, in Belfast, people don't think that way at all. Terence O'Neill had been on a visit to France for the anniversary of the Somme, and he cuts it short to come back to Stormont and to denounce the Ulster Volunteer Force. He says, it's abominable to compare yourselves to Carson and his volunteers. There's no connection between men who were ready to die for the country on the fields of France and this sordid conspiracy of criminals. And he ends with this really dramatic warning, O'Neill. He says, Northern Ireland must choose either the road to progress or return to the pointless violence of the past. And when he gives this speech, the London press say, oh, this is great. O'Neill is laying down the gauntlet, and people will undoubtedly rally to him because people don't want to go back to the sectarian hatreds of the past. But the biggest newspaper in Belfast, the Belfast Telegraph, which has a much better sense of the local mood, is much less optimistic. It says Ulster is in danger of being thrown back into a dark past thanks to those who have been sowing dragon's teeth and do not care how terrible the harvest may be. But Tom, that harvest will be much more terrible than anybody realises. Where to start this story? Well, we'll start it in what might seem a very unlikely place. We'll start it in a pebble-dash terraced council house in the village of Caledon in County Tyrone in June 1968. So Caledon is just inside the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. It was a majority Protestant, and it's controlled in 1968 by the Unionist Party. And as we described last time, if you're controlled by the Unionist Party, if you're in a village there or town, then most of the houses, almost all of them, are given to Unionist voters, i.e. Protestants. There are more than 250 Catholic families in the area that are on the waiting list for housing. And some of those families have been waiting for as long as a decade. But this particular council house, which is 9 Kinnaird Park, has just been allocated to a 19-year-old woman called Emily Beattie, who is a secretary for a local solicitor who's very big in the Unionist Party. Emily Beattie is engaged to a member of the reservist B Specials, and she is, of course, a Protestant. And to local Catholics, the fact that she's getting this house seems absolutely outrageous. And one of the people who objects is the Nationalist MP for East Tyrone, who is a young man called Austin Curry. And on the 20th of June, Curry decides he's going to occupy this house in protest. He wants the world to notice. And with 2 friends, he breaks in to the house using a poker to get in. But they're not there for very long. The local police, the RUC, throw them out a few hours later. And one of the RUC men who throws them out is Emily Beattie's brother, who's come armed with a sledgehammer. You know, nobody is hurt. Nobody is killed. It's not a massive story in the grand scheme of things. So why does it matter? Well, we talked last time about just how divisive, how toxic the issue of housing is in Northern Ireland in the 60s, both in itself, but also as a symbol of something bigger. The sense among the Catholic minority that they are second-class citizens, shut out of the top jobs, denied votes in local elections, even denied homes of their own. Now, it has to be said, a lot of working-class Protestants would take a different view of this, and we'll come back to them a bit later. And this has been going on for 40 years or so. But Austin Curry, the guy who occupied the house, is typical of a new generation. These are people who don't remember the original Troubles, because the Troubles, the name was used to refer to the earlier conflict. They don't remember the Troubles of the 1910s and 1920s. Somebody like Austin Curry, they've got TVs, they've seen the American Civil Rights Movement, they've seen Martin Luther King marching in Selma and Montgomery, all these places, and they're impatient to see change, and they're keen to learn from the American civil rights activists. Example:
This is June 1968, so a month after the events in Paris. Would that be an inspiration as well? The sense that the world can be turned upside down?
Yeah, not as much, I would say.
It's a civil rights movement.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there was a 68 mood, which I do think matters, and there are other people who are perhaps more influenced by Paris 68, but not so much Austin Curry, I would say. Anyway, so he's an example of this. He's a history graduate from Queen's, and he's become the youngest MP at Stormont. But there are others. There's a guy called Gerry Fitt. Gerry Fitt had been a stoker on a merchant navy ship. He became an Irish Labour politician, and then in 1966 he won a Westminster seat for West Belfast as a Republican Labour candidate.
So the Republicans are starting to win seats now. At the start of the 60s, you were saying that they didn't have any.
They had 0, yes, exactly. But they're starting to get 1 or 2. I think there were 2 at this point. And then there's a guy called John Hume, later very well known. John Hume came from a working class family in Derry. He got a degree in history and French, like me. He ran the campaign to have Northern Ireland's second university in the second city, Derry. And he was absolutely outraged when the authorities said, no, we're going to put it in a place called Coleraine, which is a small Protestant town, not in a Catholic city. So all three of these men, Austin Curry, Jerry Fitt and John Hume, become associated with this new movement for Catholic civil rights. They want fair electoral boundaries and end to gerrymandering. They want the fair allocation of housing. They want the end of the B specials, these kind of armed reservists, auxiliaries helping the police. And above all, I mean, the thing they say that, really resonates, particularly because of what's been going on in America, they say in local elections, we should have one man, one vote. Enough of this business of only getting a vote if you're a tenant or a homeowner. It should just be one man, one vote, universal suffrage. So when most people in Britain or America hear about this, it seems completely unobjectionable. Why would you disagree with the principle of one man, one vote? But actually, the Reverend Ian Paisley, he and his supporters would say, this civil rights movement is a Trojan horse. It is an IRA front to bring down the state that we have built here in Northern Ireland and to force us, the Protestants of Ulster, into a united Ireland. Now, most people listening to this will say, well, obviously he would say that, but that's bigoted and mad and totally wrong. But actually, this is a really, really interesting question and a surprising story. So the main civil rights organisation was called the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, NICRA, and it was founded at the beginning of 1967. And most of its members were middle-class Catholic activists, and they were genuinely outraged at what they saw as the legacy of sectarian discrimination. But when Ian Paisley and people like him said this is just an IRA front, there was actually a grain of truth in it. The IRA had done their border campaign, and they'd kind of given up on the arms struggle, and they'd focused on left-wing politics.
Yeah, they'd gone off and become woke.
They'd become woke, exactly. And as part of this wokery, they had set up a series of what they called wolf tone societies. So these were basically radical Republican talking shops. Men in polo necks and very earnest-looking women would join a wolf tone society. It's named after a revolutionary from the 1790s, and they would talk about how to bring about Irish unity, how to smash sectarianism, ideally how to bring down imperialism and capitalism as well.
And it would be presumably joined up with other freedom struggles across the world.
Of course.
The wretched of the earth.
Yeah. How can we take inspiration? All of that kind of thing. Somebody would bring along a dog-eared copy of Frantz Fanon and Albert Camus. No question whatsoever. But there would be a hard-faced man in the corner who's no stranger to blowing up a post office. That kind of thing. And it was actually from the wolf tone societies that the idea of a big civil rights campaign really took off. And when you look at the first meeting of this NICRA, Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, when you look at who was there at the first meeting, there are a load of people who like civil liberties and are members of like a Labour Party this and a Labour Party that or whatever. But there are communists and there are IRA men, including the commander of the IRA's Belfast Brigade. I mean, this isn't just me making this up. There's a brilliant book on all this by Richard English. It's probably the definitive history of the IRA called Armed Struggle.
Oh, right, Richard English.
And yeah, I know he's got very.
He would say that, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I know, mental. He's a Northern Irish historian called Richard English who writes about the IRA. I mean,
Richard Prod.
So here's the thing. In some ways, it does kind of start as an IRA front, but it becomes something much bigger. I mean, you mentioned Paris. Because it does catch the mood of the mid-60s. It attracts loads of people, especially students, who are not really interested in the IRA. They're not interested in overthrowing the state. They're not Marxists. They actually are genuinely interested in housing and in fair voting and all of this kind of stuff. So in that sense, Ian Paisley and people who are talking about the Trojan horse, they're right in one way, but wrong in another.
Isn't that history all the time?
Yeah. History is a land of contrasts. The civil rights movement might have, in some ways, started as an IRA front, but it has become something much bigger and much broader. And actually, the real tragedy of the civil rights movement really is its timing. Because as we said, it's modeled on the American civil rights movement. But the thing about the American civil rights movement that's easily forgotten is that it comes to fruition and it peaks at a point when people in America are extremely well off, including people in the South, which is booming. It's the affluent society, massive economic growth, rising wages. People feel very optimistic about the future. It's easier to make changes against that background than it is when things are bleak. And of course, in Northern Ireland, the civil rights movement is coming to prominence, 1967, 68, precisely the point when the traditional industries on which Northern Ireland depends are in real trouble. The jobs are drying up. the working class Protestants that probably you do need to persuade are frightened about economic and cultural change. So it's much more difficult. If you've come back from the shipyard, you're worried your job's going to go, and you open the newspaper and you see a load of people are complaining about something. Effectively, you have to make the concession. It's much harder to do, I would say. And this is one reason why I said we'd come back to this issue about second-class citizens. It's why it's very hard for a lot of unionists to accept the second-class citizen criticism. So there's a great book called Loyalists by Peter Taylor. Peter Taylor, BBC journalist, did 3 books called Provos, Brits, Loyalists. Basically oral histories, lots of interviews, looking at the conflict through 3 different lenses. And there's one on Loyalists. It's full of interviews with poor working class Protestants who are very defensive, indeed outraged, when they hear about Catholics saying they are second-class citizens. Our housing was the same as our Catholic next-door neighbour, 2 up, 2 down, with an outside toilet. It really irks me when I hear about the disadvantages that the Catholics had. Protestantism and unionism in Northern Ireland is not a monolith. There are a lot of very poor people who are part of that community. And they feel, when they're told, oh, you are the first-class citizens, you have the whip hand over your neighbours, they're offended by this because they don't feel that way at all. And so, of course, the tragedy, in some ways, the tragic irony of the civil rights movement is that it actually inadvertently, through no fault of their own in many ways, drives people like this into the arms of Ian Paisley and away from the centre ground and away from Terence O'Neill.
Because there was never any opportunity that they could have signed up with housing activists in Protestant community, do you think?
Well, they didn't have housing activists in Protestant communities because they were getting housing.
But they were kind of houses with no toilets. Couldn't we get together and improve housing across Northern Ireland?
There were organisations like that for you. You could join the Northern Ireland Labour Party. And the Northern Ireland Labour Party would say we are open to all people irrespective of religion and we're fighting for better conditions and rights and whatnot for working class people. That's what we're all about. But it's a less sexy story, isn't it, than one that is about suffering and adventure and fighting and dying, to quote, Gusty Spence, all of that kind of thing. That's a story that seems richer and has much more traction and is more emotionally meaningful than one that's just a bit bland and sort of old working class people getting together and fighting for better toilets or something, I would say.
Better washing machines.
Better washing machines. Well, this is the Sambrook view of history. Anyway, let's get back to Austin Currie and that house in Caledon. Asked about Paris, 1968. Of course, it's also the Prague Spring, it's student protests in America, all of this kind of thing. And when people read about Austin Currie occupying the house, they're like, yes, this is exciting. The revolution is coming to Northern Ireland. Brilliant. And a few weeks after his Caledon protest, Currie goes to a meeting of the civil rights groups and he says, let's do something bigger. Let's have a march like they have in America. Martin Luther King would do these marches through Alabama or something. Loads of publicity. Let's have a march of our own. We'll have a march to draw attention to housing discrimination in County Tyrone. And so it is that on the 24th of August, 4,000 people join him in Northern Ireland's first big civil rights demonstration. They march from the village of Coal Island to Dungannon. And it all goes well. 4,000 people, they're trudging along, they're all happy, singing songs, whatever. But the people who are on the more radical side of the movement are very disappointed. They say, well, come on. The thing about Martin Luther King's marches is they got the publicity because they were attacked, because they ended in violence. If you want to grab people's attention, you actually do need a bit of violence. You need confrontation. You need to expose the sordid reality of the state. So then people will see you as martyrs and they'll see the state for what it really is, which is repressive and cruel and violent and so on. And so they say the next march should be somewhere much more high profile, namely the city of Derry, or officially Londonderry, Northern Ireland's second city, 60-40 Catholic Protestant. Economically, Derry is really struggling. 1 in 5 men are out of work. The mood is very bleak, it is very fractious. It is the worst possible place to hold a demonstration.
And not just because it's poor, but because it has such a symbolic resonance for the Protestants.
Symbolic for both sides. Symbolic for the Catholics because it's a Catholic majority city run by Protestants. Symbolic for the Protestants because there was this siege in 1689 and they hold the Apprentice Boys of Derry March every year to remember it.
But if their goal is to get a kind of violent reaction, then they need to annoy Protestants, don't they?
Yeah, and this is the place.
You know, they want the kind of the equivalent of the bull-necked sheriff going in.
Bull Connor.
Yeah, all that kind of thing, and smacking up civil rights protesters in America. If they want the same thing, then they have to kind of press Protestant neuralgic areas.
Yeah, totally. And this is what they're doing. Their plan is they will start on the east side of the city across the River Foyle. They will cross the Craigavon Bridge. They'll go into the city centre. They will go through Protestant areas. They will end inside the city walls, which are, of course, sacred really to Protestants, where the Apprentice Boys of Derry have their parade. And they will end near the War Memorial in the centre of Derry, again, a sacred spot for Protestants. Now, as the Irish historian Tim Pat Coogan, not everybody's cup of tea, quite nationalist history, but as he rightly says in his book, The Troubles, he says it was as though Hamas were to parade through Jerusalem's holy places and conclude with a rally at the Wailing Wall.
Wow, when you put it like that.
But it's not quite as bad as that, but it's very provocative. And at Stormont, the hardline Home Affairs Minister, William Craig, who's always keen to bolster his popularity with the sort of more extreme unionists, he does the obvious thing. He bans the march, as he's empowered to do. But on the 5th of October, 1968, about 400 people, including Austin Currie and Jerry Fitt, and some, I think there's 3 British Labour MPs, they turn up at the appointed spot on Duke Street anyway. And when they turn up, they find the street is blocked at both ends by lines of RUC policemen who have been ordered to clear the road by force. Now, if you read some accounts, they will say that the Derry IRA had had a meeting beforehand. They had planned for this, and they had said, when it kicks off, make sure those MPs are in the front line so they get hit, because that will give us the publicity that we want. Well, this is exactly what happens. The RUC, they play the part appointed for them as the bull-necked kind of American sheriff. They pile into the marchers. Some of the marchers manage to get to the bridge, but there they are driven back by a water cannon into a kind of hail of baton blows. 80 or so people are taken to hospital with injuries, and one of them is Jerry Fitt, remember, a Westminster MP, who is beaten. He's dragged away, put in a police van, and taken to the police station. At the police station, the police say to him, "Clean yourself up," and he refuses. "I wanted the outside world to see the blood flowing strongly down my face." And what is really toxic for Northern Ireland's image is that an Irish TV crew, an RTE crew, had filmed the whole thing. So the footage of the RUC officers absolutely leathering Fitt and the others with their batons and their sticks goes around the world. If you kind of Google it, you can see photos of it.
I mean, that is what they wanted, isn't it? I mean, it couldn't be better for them.
You're right. From their perspective, it couldn't be better. But I think if you were to pick one moment, well, there are lots of different moments, but this is a contender for one of the moments where the sort of spiral into disaster becomes inevitable, because it's followed by days of rioting in Derry, in the working class Bogside area, very heavily Catholic. There are young men throwing stones and petrol bombs at the police, and then there are kind of copycat riots across Northern Ireland. Watching all this from Belfast, Terence O'Neill knows that he has to do something. And 5 days afterwards, he says to his cabinet, he meets his cabinet, he says, "I'm going to go to London, I'm going to see Harold Wilson, and I know that Harold Wilson is going to ask me for some pretty big changes." And O'Neill, I mean, I have to admit, I think O'Neill is hapless, but I feel really sorry for him, because I think his instincts are often, admirable. He says to his colleagues, "Look, we know how this works. Whenever there is trouble," and I quote, "the first reaction of our own people is to retreat into old hardline attitudes." He says, "Come on, let's be honest. Can any of us truthfully say in the confines of this room that the minority has no grievance calling for remedy?" He says, "We cannot govern by police power alone. It will be a very hard job to sell concessions to our people, but in this critical moment, may this not be our duty." I mean, I think now you read that and you think, fair enough. But not all of his ministers agree with him. So I already mentioned the hardline Home Affairs Minister, William Craig. William Craig says to him, "Hold on, you can't go over to London and meet Harold Wilson and sell out and let him and make you introduce reforms. Because if you do that, you will, and I quote, provoke a massive uprising in the Loyalist community. I mean, this is the dilemma for Terence O'Neill. Basically, the obvious thing might seem to be to make concessions to the Catholics, but if you do that, you're in danger of losing your base. Now, a very skillful politician might be able to do that. Whether he is that man, we will find out. He flies off to London, 4th of November, to meet Wilson and his Home Secretary, friend of the show, Jim Callaghan. Now, just for people who haven't listened to our series about Britain in the 70s, Harold Wilson, enthusiast for scouting.
Tight shorts, isn't he? Very tight shorts on holiday in the City Islands.
Loves modernisation, the Y2 technology.
Giving the Beatles MBEs.
Correct, exactly. Economic growth. He came to power. People thought he might be quite left-wing. He became more and more centrist as time went on. He had become Prime Minister in 1964. Some Labour backbenchers, as we said last time, were already complaining a lot about discrimination against Catholics in Northern Ireland. But most people in the Labour Party don't really care that much. Harold Wilson certainly doesn't care. He's much more interested in the economy, in the trade unions, in Rhodesia, even in Vietnam. When you read the diaries of his ministers like Tony Benn, Barbara Castle, Richard Crossman, they basically never talk about Northern Ireland at all. It's not the top of their list.
I think what listeners will want to know is Marcia on the scene at this point? His domineering secretary who, in the mid-70s, people are plotting to kill.
Yeah, there's no plots to kill Marcia at this point. Marcia and Harold, if they had their affair, they've had it. Remember, they slept together a number of times, but it was not satisfactory.
Found it disappointing, yeah.
So she's lurking, but it hasn't all completely gone mad at this point. It's quite understated. His Home Secretary is Jim Callaghan, friend of the show, Portsmouth, the Royal Navy, very puritanical, big man, bit of a bully, great Sambroocian hero. He's been Home Secretary since the end of 1967. As we said before, he has an Irish background, hence the name Callaghan. His grandfather had moved to England during the famine, but Callaghan basically has very little knowledge or interest of Northern Ireland. He wrote a book about it, or had a book ghostwritten for him in the early 1970s about it. I can't remember what it's called, The Problem of Ulster or something like that. And he said that when he arrived at the Home Office, they gave him a huge sort of briefing document. There was lots of stuff about prisons, race relations, the fire service, the police, and there was nothing in this document about Northern Ireland at all.
There isn't at this point a Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
No. You don't need one because it's being run from Belfast. However, Wilson and Callaghan are interested now because there's a lot of fighting. You know, there's been this business in Derry. They can see there's a problem. We're at the end of 1968. They've got a problem. They want Terence O'Neill to fix it. And they're quite hard on him, actually. For people who listen to previous series who think they're sort of all a bit limp, not at all. Harold Wilson said to him, look, you need our money. You can't survive without British money. If you don't start introducing reforms, we'll cut off your money. Callaghan, we have had enough of you stringing us along. He says, we've got a list of changes. We want to see them right away. And O'Neill said to them, look, I'm going as far as I can. I'm getting death threats from loyalists. You know, don't push this. I can't. If you push us too far, there'll be a loyalist uprising or whatever. Anyway, he goes back to Belfast and he says to his colleagues, they were very tough. I've got to give them something. And so he unveils this very limited reform package. So limited sort of reforms and who gets the vote. There's a new system for allocating housing, some police reforms, all of this. And it is your classic case of, if you'd offered this in 1963, it would have been a different story. But now it's 1968 and you please nobody at all. The civil rights activists say, come on, this, like, you've got to dismantle the whole discriminatory system. You can't just give us this. But on the other side, some of O'Neill's own ministers say, God, you're a total wuss and an appeaser. You go over to London, you let them push you around, tell us what to do in our own country. It's this guy, William Craig. It says, well, Paisley was obviously right about you. You know, you're just a weakling. You don't stand up for Ulster. You're just too interested in pleasing the English. You know, you're basically an Englishman anyway with your Eton background.
I mean, just to remind people, this is a guy who'd fought in the Second World War and taken out tank platoons, I imagine.
Most people in this story have some sort of war. I mean, it's always the way with 60s and 70s UK history, isn't it?
Except for Gerry Adams.
Yes. Well, anyway, Paisley didn't fight in the war.
No.
No doubt made warlike speeches, but I don't think he took out a German machine gun nest or anything like that.
It's the shabby men in London, isn't it, who did that?
Men with glasses, yeah, who'd become incredibly ineffectual ministers of transport or something. Anyway, so this is the context for O'Neill to give this speech. where he basically says to people, look, come on, this is where we are. Peace on one side, total disaster on the other. If you read the text, it's a very sincere appeal by a man who's clearly exhausted at the end of his tether. He says to the civil rights activists, sure, I'm not going to completely satisfy you, but this is a democracy. I ask you now with all sincerity to call your people off the streets. Your Ulstermen yourselves, we are all of us stubborn people who will not be pushed too far. And then of his critics, the hardline loyalist critics, he says they're not merely extremists, they are lunatics who would set a course along a road which would only lead to an all-island republic. They're not loyalists, but disloyalists. Disloyal to Britain, disloyal to the Constitution, disloyal to the Crown. I mean, it's quite strong stuff.
But it's punchy, isn't it?
It's punchy. And at first it seems that it might do the trick. Actually, the civil rights campaigners do listen to him. They say, fine, we will suspend our demonstrations for a month as an act of goodwill. And the Belfast Telegraph newspaper organises a petition. I'm backing O'Neill. And they get 150,000 signatures, which is a tenth of the population. But deep down, I think even O'Neill knows that he's actually left this too late. So on Christmas Eve, he wrote a note to his private secretary. He said, 1968 has been a terrible year, but 1969 is going to be even worse. As I look in the glass darkly, I see demonstrations, counter-demonstrations, meetings, rows, and general misery. And really telling is that at this point, O'Neill says to his secretary, the only real solution for this is basically for London to shut us down and impose direct rule from Westminster. But they will never do it. They don't have the courage to do it. And so we will drift from crisis to crisis. Just 10 days after that, the hopes for a sort of peaceful resolution take another big hit. So we talked about the radicalism in 1968. On New Year's Day 1969, a radical kind of socialist Republican group began a civil rights march from Belfast to Derry. And this was a group that called themselves People's Democracy. And they'd been founded at Queen's University, Belfast. And their best-known member was a young woman called Bernadette Devlin, who was 21 years old. She was a Catholic student, psychology, I think. And the People's Democracy members had been watching Paris and Prague and the American civil rights marches, and they really did want to provoke violent reprisals because they said this is the only way to expose the true nature of the state we're living in. So Bernadette Devlin, what we really wanted to do was to pull the carpet off the floor to show the dirt that was under it. And O'Neill begged them not to go ahead and do this march. Other civil rights activists asked them not to go on the march. They go on the march, and by the 4th of January, they have reached a place called Burntollet Bridge, which is 6 miles east of Derry. And here, 400 loyalists are waiting for them, armed with sticks and stones and iron bars and cudgels studded with nails. And many of these people waiting in ambush are off-duty B specials. And they absolutely lay into the student marchers, beating the living daylights out of them. And meanwhile, members of the police, the RUC, are standing there watching and doing absolutely nothing. And it's covered on TV. And it's basically just what Bernadette Devlin and the other marchers had expected, in a way what they wanted. And this is, I think, is a really good example of the point that we were talking about earlier. People often talk about the Troubles as though they sort of arise organically, by accident or by magic. Actually, this is a really good example of how they are willed into being by people who could have made different choices. Because as we said, lots of other civil rights campaigners had said, please don't go on this march, you'll only make things worse. They thought that by marching through, the People's Democracy March goes through the small Protestant towns of County Antrim. And they said, don't do this, it is needlessly provocative. But Bernadette Devlin and co., their attitude was, well, we're suffering terrible discrimination. We want to provoke people. We want the reaction. We want the publicity. And of course, on the other side, the Loyalists didn't have to turn up with their kind of cudgels and nails. They could have just let them do it. They could have just let them march.
Their strategy seems mad. It's like the nationalists have said, here's an elephant trap. Oh, brilliant. Let's jump into it. It's just lunatic behavior from them.
They would say, we're defending our state from people who want to destroy it.
I know what they say, but they have failed to understand how it will play on the screens of the world. I suppose they would say they don't care.
I suppose they would say they don't care, but I agree with you that so they haven't been watching TV, because when Martin Luther King did his marches in America, the ones that worked best were the ones where the forces of authority or white racists or whatever showed the ugly side to their society. And if you don't do that, then it's much harder to cut through with the public.
To cast yourself as the victim.
Of course. So I think everybody involved in that Burntollet Bridge story, they got what they wanted. And the person who loses most is, of course, the one person who's trying to hold the whole thing together, which is Terence O'Neill. Because this is terrible for him. Because first of all, Catholics say, but these TV pictures of people being beaten once again shows the state will not protect us. The RUC will not protect us. The B specials are not the solution. They are the problem. They are violent, bigoted, sectarian. They cannot be reformed, all this. On the other hand, the Loyalists and Unionists say, well, Burntollet Bridge shows that the civil rights activists, they're only interested in provoking disorder. They deliberately sought to provoke chaos because they want to undermine our state, and Terence O'Neill has given them far too much. He makes concessions, but it's never enough for them. Somebody one day will have to stand up to these people. This is what both sides say. And this leaves O'Neill in a really, really tricky position. And what he decides to do, he says, basically, sod it. I'm going to gamble everything. And on the 3rd of February, he decides to throw the dice. He says, I'm going to dissolve the Parliament in Stormont. I'm going to call a general election. And I'm going to say to the people of Northern Ireland, what do you want? Do you want peace or do you want civil war? Back me or sack me. I mean, he's taking a massive risk. And at the point that he's doing that in London, Harold Wilson's government at last finally wake up to how serious this is. And they say, God, we're going to have to think about a doomsday scenario here. So just 6 days afterwards, Callaghan tells one of his cabinet colleagues, Richard Crossman, who writes a diary, he says, we have been drawing up a contingency plan. If things go wrong for Terence O'Neill in this election, we may have to send British troops into the streets of Northern Ireland and to take over the government ourselves. So, as the people of Northern Ireland prepare to go to the polls, the stakes could not be higher, not least for O'Neill himself, because in his own constituency, in Bandside in Antrim, where for election after election he has been unopposed, he now faces a challenge from a unionist hardliner, a rival unionist.
And Dominic, who is this unionist hardliner?
Surprise, surprise. It is the Reverend Ian Paisley.
Unbelievable. Okay, we'll come back after the break to find out what happens in this titanic clash. This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Now, ever since the Industrial Revolution, one of the great themes of capitalist society has been the desire to reform and improve injustices. And I suppose a classic example of this would be the drive in the Victorian period to stop young children being sent up chimneys to work there as sweeps.
Yeah, and you can draw a thread, can't you, between the fight for kind of better rights for workers and better working conditions and benefits and things in the 19th century, all the way through to what happens in the 21st. So a good example of the kind of benefits that employees get these days, the benefits that Amazon offers to its employees. So they get funding of up to £3,000 a year, every year, towards training and career growth.
And Amazon offers term time working to employees with school-age children. So they can apply to get a guaranteed 10 weeks off in the year to coincide with school holidays, all the while continuing to have access to their full benefits.
Find out more at aboutamazon.co.uk/benefits-and-workplace.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Rest is History, where it is the evening of the 24th of February, 1969, and the polls have closed in the elections for a Northern Irish Parliament at Stormont, and the mood is incredibly tense, isn't it? Because for the last few weeks, the Reverend Ian Paisley has been tramping the streets with bands and drummers and holding up Bibles, and he's been denouncing the traitor
who will soon be crushed beneath the marching feet of the Protestants.
The stakes are high. So in Bandside, Terence O'Neill's supporters are watching very anxiously as the pile of Ian Paisley's votes is kind of getting higher and higher and higher. And eventually the result comes through. And Terence O'Neill has just scraped home. He's won a majority of just 1,400 votes over Paisley. And this, for somebody who had always been unopposed before, is a real shock. But actually, this is the only good news that he gets of the night. Because when you look at the rest of the results, they're very confused. He hasn't got the mandate that he wanted. In working class Protestant areas, moderate unionism has hemorrhaged support. The hardliners have done very well, and his party, although the Unionists are still in control of Stormont, of course, their party is now very deeply fractured. And after this, it's the classic story, a prime minister calls a snap election to try and shore up their authority. They don't get the mandate they wanted, and after that, they're basically a dead man walking. And the end for O'Neill comes a few weeks later, and it comes in very dramatic circumstances. On the evening of the 30th of March, 1969, he's waiting for a vote of confidence from the Ulster Unionist Council when a bomb goes off at the Castlereagh electricity substation, and that plunges half of Belfast into darkness. And in the next few weeks, there are more bombs at water installations and water pipelines and electricity stations. And so by the 26th of March, much of Belfast is without water. There are actually trucks crawling through the streets, giving water to people who can't get to standpipes. Now, in his Protestant Telegraph, Ian Paisley says this is the handiwork of the IRA. Loyalists must now appreciate the struggle that lies ahead and the supreme sacrifice that will have to be made in order that Ulster will remain Protestant. But do you know what the irony of this is? These bombs weren't planted by the IRA. They were planted by the Ulster Volunteer Force, working alongside Ian Paisley's own Ulster Protestant Volunteers.
Which Paisley presumably knew about.
He must have known about it, surely.
So he was lying.
I guess so. Yeah, he was.
I mean, that's poor from a man of the cloth.
Remember the bloke we met last time who runs the UVF, Gusty Spence?
Oh, the guy who shot everyone in pubs.
Yeah, he's in prison at this point because of his pub shooting record, although he actually denied that he had pulled the trigger. He's in prison, and he says quite openly afterwards, he says, we did this to expose O'Neill's weakness, to show people that he would be soft on the IRA if the IRA were to blow things up. It was carefully planned to bring down O'Neill, to quote him directly. And it works, because 2 days after the peak of the water business, O'Neill resigns as Prime Minister. He's absolutely exhausted. He's totally demoralised. He can't see any future, sort of prosperous future for Northern Ireland. And when he goes on TV to explain this, he's completely candid. He says, the old fears, the old prejudices, the old loyalties were too much for me and I couldn't overcome them.
I suppose the problem for him was that he seemed too kind of posh, too landed, too grand. And so I imagine that the obvious strategy for his party is to elect as his replacement someone with roots in the local community, someone who, the average guy in the pub on the Shankill Road could identify with. So is that what they do?
No, they basically choose the same person again. I mean, this is a bit harsh because there are differences, but the person they choose is yet another member of the landed gentry, and he's James Chichester Clark. He's a landowner from County Londonderry. So Terence O'Neill, you may remember, went to Eton. James Chichester Clark went to Eton. So
he's another old Etonian.
Yeah. He joined the Irish Guards. I think actually Terence O'Neill did as well. He rose to a major. He was at Anzio.
Oh, so better than O'Neill.
Yeah, exactly. He was wounded at Anzio and he was left with injuries that plagued him all his life. He is more hardline than O'Neill. He'd actually resigned because he didn't agree with the way they were bringing in one man, one vote. But O'Neill is more urbane. Chichester Clark he's a bit of a farmer. He's sort of slow. He's a bit wooden. He's very earnest. He has no sort of flair or imagination. And Ian Paisley, when he was asked, what do you make of Chichester Clark? He said, I've already taken down a captain. I reckon I can handle a major. So ominous. And Chichester Clark inherits a situation that's now really spiralling out of control. So in Derry, we talked about Derry. In Derry, random sectarian violence is becoming much more common. People being beaten up at night. You're walking down the street. There's a group of men. They say to you, what's your name? Where are you from? If you give the wrong answer, they basically kick the living daylights out of you. there's a terrible story which is in the headlines at this point. So in Derry, in the Bogside district, a group of policemen had invaded the home of a taxi driver called Samuel Devaney, and they beat him up so badly that he later died of his injuries. And this is a huge scandal. And on top of all this, there has just been a by-election in Mid-Ulster, a Westminster by-election, and the winner was the 21-year-old Bernadette Devlin of the People's Democracy Group, who at the time became the youngest woman ever to win a Westminster seat. And she gave her maiden speech on the 22nd of April in the Commons in London, Westminster. She gave a speech that got enormous attention and praise at the time, especially from sort of more left-leaning papers in Britain. She said there can be no justice in Northern Ireland while the Unionists run it. They are corrupt, bigoted and self-interested. She basically dared Harold Wilson to abolish Stormont and rule Northern Ireland from Westminster. I was reading the speech yesterday. There's a very telling moment. She says to him, people are saying now maybe you could send in troops to keep the peace. She says, this is a very bad idea. If British troops are sent in, I should not like to be either the mother or the sister of an unfortunate soldier stationed there. The one point in common among Ulstermen is they are not very fond of Englishmen who tell them what to do.
So they'll be enjoying this podcast.
Surely. So Bernadette Devlin's given her speech. What's Harold Wilson up to? Wilson and his government, they've lost Terence O'Neill now. They've got this other bloke, Chichester Clark. And on the 7th of May, the cabinet have a meeting, and Jim Callaghan says look, I know we hate talking about Northern Ireland because it's really boring, but we have to talk about it. Here are the different options. And he says one of the options is we could send in troops and run the province ourselves. And loads of Harold Wilson's ministers say, oh, that's mad. No, we don't know anything about this. Best not get involved. We don't know anything about it. So Dennis Healy, the Defence Secretary, also an Anzio man, of course, with their famous hinterland, Dennis Healy says, and I quote, it would be crazy to go in there and take things over. We would be siding with the Roman Catholics and the civil rights movement against the government and the RUC, although we know nothing at all about it. That line, we know nothing
honest,
at all about
it.
Yes. The amazing thing about this, I think that's so comical in some ways, that runs through this story for about 10 years, is people in Britain say, well, obviously we know nothing at all about this, and we never will. So let's either not get involved or just make terrible random decisions. But obviously informing themselves about it would be an outlandish.
Yeah, I mean, he wants to bother with something as dull as that.
Whenever they say we know nothing about it, they talk as though that's like a fact of nature or an act of God that cannot possibly be remedied, and they shouldn't be ashamed of it.
Isn't that a legacy of how intractable the Irish question was in the early decades of the 20th century? That it's hardwired into British politicians. We don't understand this.
We don't understand this, and there's something wrong with you if you take an excessive interest in it. It's somehow suspect to be overly informed about this, and the best thing to do is to take no interest in it whatsoever. Of course, though, the British government may not be interested in Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland is going to be interested in them. And a big theme of this story is that British governments are constantly sort of struggling to catch up because they are always behind the pace of events. So the 12th of July, there are big parades. This is the high point of what's called the marching season. So for people unfamiliar with Northern Ireland, there are annual parades held by the Orange Order and other Protestant societies to celebrate things like the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. And they are always tense. And this time, 12th of July 1969, the sort of fighting and rioting surrounding the parades is worse than ever. And in the next few weeks, there is more rioting, especially in Belfast. You have rival gangs forcing Catholic and Protestant families out of their homes, different gangs. And everybody knows the next flashpoint will come on the 12th of August, because this is the annual march of the Apprentice boys of Derry. So this is the biggest of all Northern Ireland's Protestant parades, and it commemorates the relief of Derry by William of Orange's troops in 1689. Derry had been under siege by James II and the sort of Jacobite army, and the Protestant William of Orange, William III, relieved the city. And it's seen as this totemic moment in the history of Ulster Protestants. And they mark it every year. 15,000 members of the Orange Order march through the streets. Flutes, drums, they're wearing their sashes, they've got their bowler hats on. They would say They do say to this day, this is an expression. It's one of our great communal traditions, an expression of our history, of our culture, of our identity.
There was that famous image of an American tourist in a cab getting caught up in it and thinking it was great and kind of grooving along to it, loving Irish customs.
Yeah, exactly. I remember that. Yeah, that's so comical. Now, obviously, in 1969, this is going to be incredibly fraught. James Chichester Clark could ban it. He has the power to ban it. But of course he's not going to, because that would tank his reputation among the Protestants of Northern Ireland. And it would be a massive gift to Ian Paisley. He's never going to ban it. James Callaghan, as Home Secretary, could ban it. But Callaghan decides, I'm not going to ban it. A delegation of Labour backbenchers went to see him and said, come on, Jim, what are you going to do about this march? And he said, we have a policy, we don't interfere in Northern Ireland. The problems of Northern Ireland should be solved within Northern Ireland without any outside intervention. Goes back to your point about the Irish question. Basically, he would say we've learned in Britain to stay out of Ireland and to get involved as little as possible, because when we do, it always goes wrong. But of course, this means the march goes ahead, and this sets the stage for one of the landmark set-piece confrontations of the entire Troubles. So we're in early August. In Derry, the Catholics are preparing for a fight. They have set up a Citizens Defence Association under an IRA veteran called Sean Keenan. They are stockpiling petrol bombs. They are planning barricades at street corners. They're preparing for trouble. We get to the night of the 11th, the day before the parade. The first barricades go up in the Catholic Bogside area. But in the Protestant areas, people have already lit bonfires celebrating the parade. Everybody knows this is going to be it's going to be very spicy tomorrow. The 12th dawns. At noon, the Apprentice boys, as they're called, the kind of fraternal order and their allies, they form into parade order on the city walls. And below, there are groups of kind of Catholic teenagers and young men shouting abuse up at them, and they're throwing coins down, sort of traditional gesture of contempt. They're throwing pennies down at the Catholics below. A couple of hours later, the first scuffles break out. People are throwing nails and stones as the Apprentice boys set off on their march. The RUC, the police, have put barriers to keep the two sides apart. But by late afternoon, most of these barriers have been dismantled, and basically the march has degenerated into a kind of general melee. At this point, desperate to kind of regain control of the streets, the RUC launch a baton charge into the Bogside. So this is a kind of fairly tightly packed Catholic area of Londonderry or Derry. And when they advance, they're actually walking into a trap, because the Derry Citizens Defence Association, they've got kids with petrol bombs on top of the high-rise flats at the entrance to the Bogside. So they're throwing down these petrol bombs. And as night falls, there's a scene of total chaos. There are baton charges, petrol bombs, there are burning shops. The RUC bring up their water cannons. They start firing tear gas. It's an incredible sort of scene of disorder. By dawn the next morning, which is the 13th, the Bogside has basically become a battle zone. The RUC are camped just outside it, kind of holding a front line. Inside it, people have set up emergency first aid stations. They've got women and children in kind of relays making petrol bombs. And they've got a kind of weird catapult thing on top of these high-rise flats. It's like firing petrol bombs down at the police. One British reporter who was there said, I wasn't really shocked by the hatred of the Catholic residents for the police, because I kind of expected that. He said, what shocked me was the hatred coming from the RUC, from the police themselves. And I quote, the obscenities, the threats, the religious tauntings, and all coming from a peacekeeping force. But it has to be said, Derry's Protestants don't see it that way. So I mentioned Peter Taylor's book, Loyalist. In that book, he's got a quote from a shop assistant who went down to the front line to help the police. And this bloke said, what I saw was an insurrection. I saw groups of people defying law and order, trying to destroy Northern Ireland, and the police were the bulwark against them. They needed all the help they could get. So all day the fighting continues. And then night falls on the 13th. This is day 2, remember, and it's still a stalemate. The RUC is still camped at the entrance to the Bogside. There are shops and homes burning. There are clouds of tear gas. And at this point, the Derry Citizens Defence Association issues a public statement, and they say, we're appealing to every able-bodied man in Ireland to come and help us. Now, every able-bodied man in Ireland, of course, there are a lot of people in Ireland who live in the Republic of Ireland. And all this time, the government in Dublin has really tried to stay out of this. Remember, they still have this sort of nominal claim to the entire island of Ireland, which they have never really bothered to pursue. All this time, they have issued well-meaning statements defending Catholic interests, but they have kept pretty quiet. But that evening, the Taoiseach, Jack Lynch, so he's from Cork, actually, he says, okay, I'm going to have to say something. I have to. And he's quite a mild-mannered man. You can see the clip online. Lynch goes on Irish TV and he says, we've been watching in horror the scenes in Derry, and this cannot continue. The Parliament of Northern Ireland has clearly lost control, and the Irish government can no longer stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse. He says, I'm asking the British to allow UN international peacekeepers to keep the two sides apart, and I've told the Irish Army to set up field hospitals along the border so that injured Catholics who don't want to go to Northern Irish hospitals can be treated by our army field hospitals.
The Irish Army.
Right. And as soon as you mention the Irish Army, right, that makes things immeasurably worse. Because in Northern Ireland, the reaction to Lynch's speech is like, oh my God, the Irish Army are coming. They're going to get stuck in as well. And loads of people completely wildly don't really pay attention to the details of his remarks, but they just genuinely assume that the Irish Army is about to cross the border and it's really all going to kick off. So in the Bogside, people are delighted. They're like, brilliant, our co-religionists are coming to our aid. But local Protestants in the town and the surrounding villages, they're like, oh my God, the Irish Army are coming. We've got to go and support our police. So they all pile into the streets to support the RUC. You then that evening have a scene of unbelievable chaos. So the RUC who've been actually fighting the people in the Bogside, there's now a third element, which is this great Protestant mob, which breaks through the RUC lines into the Bogside. The Catholics then pile into them. Massive fighting. One RUC man starts shooting and wounds two people.
How many people have died in this? Have anybody died?
Nobody has died yet. Meanwhile, that same night, so we're on the 13th, so Jack Lynch has made his speech. It's day 2. Fighting breaks out in Belfast. People in Belfast have been watching this, and everybody in Belfast now is expecting a similarly apocalyptic showdown in Belfast. So, to quote one young loyalist, everybody was involved, the whole community. Basins of water were set out and doors left open for people to run into. Everybody was bracing themselves for what they believed was going to be a massive attack from the nationalists on the Falls Road. Of course, the people on the Falls Road are expecting exactly the same thing. They're like, the people on the Shankill Road are about to attack us. So we enter the third day of this, Thursday, the 14th of August. In Derry, the RUC are basically exhausted. They've lost control. They send out a call, mobilize all the B specials. And all these B specials start to assemble outside the Bogside with all their weapons, right? They've got makeshift weapons and all this. They're intermingled with crowds of Protestant teenagers and young men and whatnot, getting ready to launch, like, let's go in and take this by force. In Belfast, things are actually, if anything, even worse. It's properly kicked off in Belfast. So there are loyalist gangs roaming the streets. They're throwing petrol bombs into Catholic schools. They're burning down Catholic houses. We're right back in the 1920s, back in 1921 or 22 or something. Meanwhile, you've got the first gunfights between the police and the IRA. Remember, the IRA had gone quiet in the 1960s, but they had not gone away. And the local IRA commander in Belfast, Liam Macmillan, has called up some of his old comrades, says, come on, we've got to go and defend our people. But you asked about guns before. They don't have many guns. They have 2 submachine guns. They've got a Lee Enfield rifle and they've got 6 revolvers. So they're sort of all competing to see who gets the guns. And the fighting becomes concentrated on Divis Street. So if you look at the map, the people who are interested, Divis Street is basically the entrance to the Catholic Falls Road area. And there you have the IRA firing with these 2 machine guns and whatnot at loyalists and the police, and the RUC are firing back with armoured cars with heavy machine guns on the armoured cars. And in all of this kind of chaos, the armoured cars start firing into the high-rise flats, the Divis Street flats, and they hit a Catholic schoolboy called Patrick Rooney, who was in bed trying to sleep through this. And he was the first child killed in the Troubles. He was just 9 years old. Actually, the amazing thing is that the casualties aren't even higher. 7 people were killed in total, 2 of them shot by the IRA, 1 by Loyalists, and 4 of them by the security forces. Probably 1,000 injured. It's hard to tell because it was often said that Catholics would be less likely to go to hospital. But what's very ominous, of the people injured, more than 100 of them are injured with gunshot wounds. So this is the point where the shooting has really started in earnest. 200 homes are destroyed. Probably get just under 2,000 families have to flee their homes, and a lot of those end up basically going as refugees across the Irish border. I mean, as melodramatic as it sounds, the Irish government actually established kind of refugee camps on the southern side of the border. Now, in Britain, Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan, who of course can't have been expected to do anything about this because they don't know anything about it, they are watching the TV pictures in absolute horror, because it's pretty clear at this point that unless something changes, Northern Ireland is going to head for a full-scale kind of civil war. And the pressure to intervene is overwhelming. So the civil rights campaigners, people like John Hume and Jerry Fitt, in the last couple of days have started begging Westminster to send troops. Jerry Fitt tells the story that on the 14th of August, he's in Belfast. He's actually taken refuge from the fighting in a bookmaker's. That's his excuse anyway. He's in a bookies, and he says a crowd of Catholic people came in, and they were, quote, screaming and shouting that they were going to be murdered in their beds and begging me to get the army in. And he rang James Callaghan and said, "I'm pleading with you, Jim, send in the army." And I'll never forget his reply. "Jerry," he says, "I can get the army in, but it's going to be a devil of a job to get it out." So it's a very good story. Whether this actually happened, I don't know. But actually, the decisive request comes from Stormont itself, from the Northern Ireland government. Late that afternoon, the 14th of August, James Chichester Clark formally asked London to send troops into the streets of Derry. Now, Callaghan, when he got the call, was on a plane. He was coming back, almost unbelievably, he was coming back from the Scilly Isles, where he'd gone to meet Harold Wilson, who was on holiday in his shorts. And he got a note from the navigator on the plane. Basically, Chichester Clark was asking you to send in the troops, permission to send in the troops, and Callaghan scribbled on a note on it and handed it back to the navigator, the words, "permission granted." And at 5 o'clock that afternoon, the 1st Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment marched towards the Bogside, and almost immediately at that point, the various combatants kind of downed tools and retreated back into their homes and whatnot. And the next afternoon, the 15th, Callaghan got a second request. This time, can you send troops into Belfast as well? And by nightfall on the 15th, the British soldiers are marching down the Catholic Falls Road. And this is a massive moment in this story. A massive moment. I mean, we grew up with British troops on the streets of Northern Ireland, but this is when it all started.
Yeah, and all those kind of search points and helicopters and things. And it is obviously seen as a mistake, a terrible mistake, to send the troops in. But what alternative was there? If they didn't get sent in, then the whole thing just explodes and becomes Bosnia or whatever.
It's one of those things that American newspapers in the 60s used to always have this joke that, Americans would go on holiday to Ireland, and they get lost in the lanes of Ireland, and they, wind down the window. You'd ask a sort of farmer or something, "How do I get to Dublin from here?" And the farmer would say, "Well, to start with, I wouldn't start from here." And this is, I think, what you'd say about this story, that by the time when you're making that decision, do we send troops in or not, it's actually too late. The ship has sailed. You're in a massive mess, and you're not going to put it right. I think there is no scenario at this point when the fighting is so bad, when people are firing submachine guns and people are being shot, and there's like armored cars with machine guns firing into tower blocks. There is no way you're not going to send troops. I mean, any British government at this point would have sent the troops. The problem, of course, is they've sent the troops and they have absolutely no political strategy about how they're going to put this right. And the time to fix it would have been 10 years previously, 20 years previously, but not now. When you've let it get to this
But that's
point.
not very helpful advice, is it? If you're
No, it's not helpful advice. I wouldn't start from
advising,
here. Yeah.
So basically, they have to do it, despite all the horrors that will then follow.
If they hadn't done it, lots of people would have been killed, and everyone internationally would have said, what an unbelievable act of irresponsibility from the British government. They have this army, but they won't use it to protect citizens of the United Kingdom.
But at this point, it is seen by Catholics as peacekeeping.
Yes, totally. I mean, this is the great irony of this, right? That the British Army was sent in to protect, largely to protect Catholics.
Because I'm just thinking of Withnail and I, famous film set in late '69, and Withnail pretends that he's been in the army in a pub in Cumbria.
Yes.
He says, I've served in Northern Ireland. And the landlord says, crack at the Mick.
Yes.
But actually, that's historically inaccurate because at this point, that is not how it is being seen.
It's a very good point. It's seen as protecting the Catholics. Exactly so. I mean, on the British troops, if the politicians don't know anything about Northern Ireland, I think it's a pretty safe bet that like a load of 18, 19, 20-year-old squaddies don't. They have no idea what awaits them. There's this famous story that when they sent the first lot of reinforcements, the reinforcements were flown into an airfield and they were sort of bussed into the centre of Belfast or to their barracks or whatever. And they all stopped at a petrol station to buy maps of Belfast because they didn't have any maps. And as far as they're concerned, this is going to be pretty easy. I mean, don't forget, they've been in Cyprus in the 50s. They've been in Malaya. They've been in Kenya.
Malaya, they had defeated an insurgency, hadn't they?
Of course they had.
It's the kind of the model of how to defeat an insurgency.
A lesson for the Americans of Vietnam, which the Americans did not heed. And they think, well, by these standards, this is going to be pretty straightforward. As far as I understand, can you imagine them saying to each other, as far as I understand it, there's a load of Protestants, there's a load of Catholics. The Protestants are kicking 7 bells out of the Catholics. Our job is to go in, tell them to stop, separate them, and then we can all go home. Bang, job done. And at first, they are welcomed with open arms. I mean, you can see the news footage, you can see photos, you can read the reports online. Catholics shouting at them, thank you for coming, people clapping and cheering them. Stories about in Derry, people would bring them fish and chips. People would kind of winch fish and chips up the city walls to them and stuff. There was in Peter Taylor's book, Brits, he has a quotation from an interview with a soldier in Belfast. I felt like a knight in shining armour. Kids were following you everywhere. There were tea and buns and sandwiches. They'd be out there with trays. I must have put on about a stone, this guy says. You can see photos of soldiers leaning on their armoured cars. They're showing kids their guns. They're chatting up housewives. It's very chummy. In fact, so chummy that old Republicans were shocked by it. So Brendan Hughes, who was later the commander of the IRA in Belfast, said, I was young and I can remember people bringing them tea at the street corners, and my dad, who was an old kind of IRA bloke, and my dad objecting to it, saying, I never thought I would see the day when, nationalists, Catholics would be bringing cups of tea and fish and chips and cakes and stuff to British soldiers. At the end of August, so not long afterwards, Callaghan flies to Northern Ireland to see how it's all going. And he goes to Derry, he goes to the Bogside. There are already no-go areas that are painted with white lines. And he steps over the white lines to go into the no-go areas, and it's fine. People, thank him, they clap him and stuff, they cheer him. And when he gets back to London, the papers say, well, James Callaghan, who'd been a terrible chancellor and had moved to Home Secretary, this Northern Ireland business has completely rebuilt his reputation. He's the man of the hour. British decisiveness and sang-froid have prevailed. But actually on this trip, Callaghan, because he's not an idiot, he notices that he's getting a lot of smiles from the Catholics, but he's not getting many smiles from the Unionists. And a lot of the hardliners are really not happy at all. As one of them said later, it felt as if we were being invaded by our own army. And he has this incredible exchange with Ian Paisley. Callaghan, who was a Baptist, said to Ian Paisley, Dr. Paisley, we're all the children of God. And Tom, what does Ian Paisley say?
No, we are not, Mr. Callaghan. We are the children of wrath.
Yeah. And I guess at some level, Paisley is right. Because at this point, August 1969, they are the children of wrath. It is too late probably to turn back. There is too much distrust. There's too much antagonism. There's too much violence. And I think a point that's probably not brought out as often as it should be, because in the wake of the sort of peace agreement, there's to some degree a slight culture of forgetting, which is completely understandable, by the way, politically. But I think what's underestimated is how much everything that goes wrong, a lot of it is willed by people who actively wanted to see things get worse because it would suit their political interests. So people who wanted to see fighting and who connived at killing and escalation and all of this. So loyalists who wanted a showdown with the sort of the enemy within, Republicans who wanted to see the violence escalate because they wanted to turn people against the British. They wanted to get a united Ireland. I always think that the obvious parallel is the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So in 1994 or something in Bosnia, people would say, well, this is all the result of ancient hatreds. There's nothing anyone can do about it. Or they would say, well, actually, it's just being directed by a few malevolent, monstrous people who've led their voters sort of down the road of chaos and hatred and all of this. And actually, what's the truth is, it's the interplay of two different things. It's the interplay of the context, the history of suspicion and conflict, which can't be wished away, but also individual decision makers. We've seen them in already, Ian Paisley or whoever, or the people who organise the marches, or the people who deliberately try to provoke violence, or the people who pick up their guns. People who, for what perhaps seem to them rational political reasons, they consciously decide to choose escalation and tension rather than, as they would call it, appeasement. And already, actually, at this point, so we're in late summer of 1969, there are lots of people, young men largely, in Belfast and Derry who are saying, okay, well, that was round one, but round two is coming very soon. The state won't protect us. We need to protect ourselves. We need guns. We need to get ready. And, when the shooting starts next time, we will be, we're not going to mess around. And in fact, they don't have long to wait. Because on the 10th of October, the British government published a report on the recent disorder. And insanely, this report was written by Sir John Hunt, the man who had led the expedition to conquer Everest in 1953. It wasn't the fact that he was a great mountaineer that gave him the expertise. He was also in the British Army. His recommendations were the army should take over kind of military policing from the RUC and let us disband the B specials. The Catholics hate them. They see them as a tool of oppression. Get rid. And this sets off 3 days of rioting in the Protestant Shankill Road. You have this extraordinary spectacle of mobs attacking British troops while waving the Union Jack. We are the defenders of Britain against you. And the climax comes on the night of the 11th. 2,000 people marching on these high-rise flats on Divis Street, which have been guarded by lines of British troops. It's a pitched battle, stones, petrol bombs, tear gas, the usual. Somebody starts shooting in the chaos, and the troops start shooting back. 66 people are injured, 21 of them soldiers. 2 local men, George Dickey and Herbert Howe, who are both Protestants, are shot dead by the British Army. And also killed is a young RUC constable called Victor Arbuckle, who's 29. He was married with 2 very small children, a boy and a girl, and he was killed, ironically, by a sniper not from the IRA, but from the Ulster Volunteer Force. He was the first Northern Irish policeman to be killed in the Troubles, but he was not, alas, the last.
No, far from it. So next time we will be heading into the 1970s, and Northern Ireland will be spiralling towards effectively a civil war. So in the next episode, the Provisional IRA will be entering the story. The British Army will be taking its first casualties. The bombings will worsen. And Ted Heath, hero of our series on 1974, enters the chat. And people will be stunned to hear that Ted Heath's government is preparing to take a truly disastrous gamble. What are the odds on that? And then in our final episode, the bloodiest year of the Troubles, which is 1972, Bloody Sunday in Derry, Bloody Friday in Belfast, and one last chance for peace. So club members, of course, can hear those 2 episodes right now. And if you're not a member, you can join them on therestishistory.com. And members also receive our brilliant newsletter full of amazing features, quizzes, competitions, just unbelievable value.
Essays by historians.
Essays by historians. Who doesn't love an essay by a historian? I know I love an essay by a historian.
Of course you do.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thanks, Dominic. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.